All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call a joint Senate revenue meeting to order, and I will have Mr. Reel please call the roll.
Senator Dennis, Senator Tatro,
Present.
Assemblywoman Anderson,
Present.
Assemblywoman Considine,
Present.
Assemblyman Hafen,
Here.
Assemblywoman Kasama, Vice Chair Cohen,
Here.
Chair Neal.
Here.
Madam Chair, I believe you do still have a quorum with the 5 members that are present.
So we'll mark Kasama and Dennis present as they arrive. Okay, so before we get started, just want to do some simple housekeeping items now that we are pretty much online for the interim. First of all, for today's meeting, you can access the committee's webpage located on the Nevada Legislative website. And anyone who would like to receive electronic notifications regarding the committee's agendas, minutes, and final report can do so by signing up on the legislative website. Any votes that are taken today, which there won't be, will be done with a roll call vote. There will be a public comment period at the beginning and at the end of the meeting, and public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Public comment can be provided in 4 different ways, all of which are listed on the agenda. The first way is by calling the phone number 669-900-6833 and then entering a meeting ID, which is 875-2400-0631, and then pressing the hashtag sign or pound. The next method is by emailing Rev Interim at lcb.state.nv.us. The third is mail your written comments to Fiscal Analysis Division. And then the fourth, we still have faxes, which is kind of awesome. You can fax to 775-684-6600. All right. So additionally, our broadcast and production services, BPS, until unit has recently implemented the use of a different version of Zoom, the virtual meeting platform for the legislative committees. We have, I guess we'll have a statement from Brian Fernley on this new platform. Who's our ledge counsel? Mr. Fernley?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to go over a new, what the committee needs to do with regard to the chat function in the, with this new version of Zoom that's being used. With this new platform, the chat feature is only to be used for technical cast and production services. It can be used for any communication between members of the committee or by presenters, unless they are requesting assistance from BPS. If somebody posts to the chat feature during the meeting, the chair will ask the presenter to read into the record the information posted to the chat, and will at that time remind everyone that the chat function is to be used exclusively to request technical assistance from BPS. In addition, any links or information that a presenter would like shared during their presentation should be included in their slide deck or other meeting materials that are provided to the committee and must not be sent to members through the chat feature. So again, it is just a reminder that the chat feature is to be used exclusively to request technical assistance from BPS and not to communicate among members of the committee and the presenters. Thank you.
Okay, members, do you have any questions on this new adjustment? Okay, seeing none. So I'm going to kind of, reverse this a little bit. I'm going to introduce our ledge council staff, our legislative bureau staff first before we get into committee introductions. We have our infamous Russell Ginden. who is our Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst, who's trying to leave us very, very soon. And we have Mr. Michael Nakamoto. Michael, I can't see you on camera. He has, and I don't want to embarrass you, Michael, but I did notice the goatee. Love it. All right. And then we have Mr. Joe Reel, who is also Deputy Fiscal Analyst, and he's trying to leave us super soon in the summer. And I also wanted to announce our committee secretary, who is from the Fiscal Analysis Division, Ms. Anna Freeman. She is the one who is sending you all the emails, the packets, and getting everyone up to date. And then finally, who we just heard from is Brian Fernley, our legislative counsel, who's been assigned to the committee from the legal division. And I'm very happy to still have him a part of the committee. And so now we will go and do committee introductions. I will go last, so I will call on Vice Chair Cohen to introduce herself to whoever's online and potentially loves the topic of revenue.
Thank you, Chair. Leslie Cohen. I represent Assembly District 29 in Southern Nevada. I'm happy to be back on revenue after 3 sessions in revenue, and happy to be your vice chair and to be back with the revenue team.
And I don't believe, has Senator Dennis joined us? I don't see him. Okay, so I will call on Senator Tatro.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. My name is Don Tatro. I was recently appointed to the Senate District 16 seat, and this is my first meeting, so I'm looking forward to it, and just glad to be here. So thank you very much.
All right. And next, Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Neal. Sorry about that. Assemblywoman Natha Anderson. This is my first session, and I represent Assembly District 30, which is mostly Sparks, a little bit of the Reno area in Washoe County, and very excited to again serve on. I served on revenue during the session, and then also I'm interested on what's going to happen during interim. Thank you so much for chairing it, and looking forward to all the discussions.
Okay, thank you. Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you, Chair Neal. I am Assemblywoman Venetia Considine. I represent the east side of Las Vegas and a little bit of Henderson. I just completed my first legislative session, and I was on revenue, which I enjoyed a lot, and I'm really looking forward to learning more during the interim session. Thank you.
Okay, and next is Assemblyman Hafen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gregory Hafen, Assembly District 36, taxpayer. So I'm always interested in what we're going to be doing. I've always enjoyed working with Chair Neal as her favorite assemblyman. So at least on the right side of the aisle. Looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have, and hopefully we can cut some of these taxes, right?
No. Okay. So Assemblywoman Kasaba.
Well, that's a nice act to follow there. So thank you, Chair Neal. Glad to be serving on the interim committee. I did serve on the Assembly Revenue Committee during the session, which was my first session. I am Assemblywoman Heidi Kasama, representing District 2, which is the west side of our Las Vegas Valley in the Summerlin area. And just looking forward to learning more about the committee and how we can help all of our constituents.
Thank you for that. And I still don't see Senator Dennis as of yet. He had an appointment, but I'm sure he will show up soon. So I am Senator Dina Neal. I represent Senate District 4. I've been on tax or / revenue since 2011 on the Assembly side, and now I'm serving as Senate Revenue Chair on the Senate side. So my whole legislative life, I have been on some tax, pretty much. So I'm glad to chair it. The interim, this will be the first time we've ever had an interim revenue committee. And so I look forward to being able to, number one, talk about issues without having to shut the committee down for the next committee, and to really dig deep into some concepts that we really need to understand to move our state forward, and hopefully to modernize our state tax statutes, not necessarily cut taxes, but modernize and move us into a place where our tax statutes represent the needs of this state, minus federal government assistance. All right then. So with that said, we will go ahead and roll into public comment. At BPS, if there's anyone logged in for public comment, we'll take public comment.
Thank you, Chair Neal. At this time, there are no participants in the queue wishing to speak. Would you like to take a moment?
No. I think we're good. I mean, whoever's here for revenue is going to be on probably towards the end if they have questions. So we will just go ahead and move into agenda item number 4, which is the adoption of the committee policies. Mr. Reel, am I turning this over to you to talk about the committee policies?
I'd be happy to do that, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Committee members, the committee policies that are before you are essentially a combination of the policies that were established during the 21 session between the Senate Committee on Revenue and Economic Development and the Assembly Revenue Committee. And they have just been adjusted slightly to incorporate for a joint committee during the interim. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about those policies.
Members, any questions on the committee policies? So then we will take a motion to approve and adopt the committee policies for the interim revenue. Do I have a first?
I'll move to adopt the policies.
Was that similar?
Oh, sorry, Assemblywoman Cohen.
Okay, Vice Chair Cohen, thank you. Do I have a second?
Second from Assemblywoman Kasama.
Okay, thank you. So is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, maybe my dog is offering a motion, but we will go ahead and move for a roll call vote. Mr. Reel, please call the vote.
Senator Dennis, he was still absent. Senator Tatro.
Aye.
Assemblywoman Anderson.
Aye.
Assemblywoman Considine.
Aye.
Assemblyman Hafen.
Aye.
Assemblywoman Kasama.
Yes. Sorry, I had to find my mute.
Vice Chair Cohen.
Aye.
And Chair Neal.
Yes. All right, so the motion passes and we have adopted our committee policies. Next, we will move to agenda item number 5, and I will introduce Jackson Brainard from NCSL. He is going to present the 2022 outlook for revenue. Jackson, are you?
Hi, Chair Neal. Yes, thank you. Let me pull up my presentation real quick. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Appreciate you inviting me to speak today. Again, my name is Jackson Brainard, and I'm a program principal with the National Conference of State Legislatures Fiscal Affairs Program. I cover tax, economic development, and gambling issues, and I'm going to be providing an overview on state fiscal trends, recent state tax actions, and what we're likely to see develop on the revenue front in 2022. If you're not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the states and territories. We provide research and analysis on all manner of policy topics. We lobby on behalf of state interests at the federal level, and we promote learning and communication between states. I just want to clarify that we do not have an official position on ideal state tax systems or tax bases. So before I get into recent state tax actions and what's in store for the future, I just want to give a quick overview of state tax systems and how they raise revenue. Every state tax system is unique, but Nevada's differs a little bit more significantly from most other states by virtue of not having a corporate or personal income tax. So it might be worthwhile to review how other states fund their operations. The personal income tax and the sales tax, typically the two largest categories, followed by the corporate income tax. In addition to Nevada, there are another 8 states that also don't have a personal income tax and 5 that don't have a sales tax. There are also 5 other states that don't have a corporate income tax in addition to Nevada, but most of them do tax businesses in the form of a gross receipts tax, similar to Nevada's commerce tax. Texas has a margins tax, Ohio has a corporate activities tax, and Washington has a business and occupation tax. The largest portion of state tax collection comes from the personal income tax. You can see it's green in this pie chart here, followed closely by the sales tax. Those are far and away the 2 largest tax categories. The corporate income tax is a much smaller but significant slice, around 5%. Then you have the selective sales tax category. That includes all of the excise taxes that are levied on specific goods and services, your motor fuel tax, your tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, amusements. The other tax category, 8.4%, includes things like severance taxes on oil and gas, state taxes, licensing taxes, and then the property taxes, the largest state and local tax revenue source, but it is primarily a local revenue tool, although some states do levy narrow taxes on things like utilities. Not pictured here are charges and fees or federal transfers to states, which is the most important supporter of state fiscal health, as it accounts for about 1/3 of total state revenue. And then this next slide just illustrates how certain states can vary in terms of their reliance on these taxes. States with extensive mineral resources or unique tourist attractions are able to rely on a more narrowly based system than other states. You look at Alaska, they don't have a personal income tax or a sales tax, and they're able to generate a significant majority of their revenue from severance taxes and royalties from the oil and gas industry. South Dakota and Nevada have no income tax and are therefore very reliant on sales and excise taxes. A state like Oregon has no sales tax, so leans heavily on the personal income tax. And most states rely on a balanced variety of revenue sources because it can help ensure stability in collections. And we've seen how important budget stability can be for states over the last couple of years. All taxes fluctuate with the economy, but historically speaking, the sales tax is the most stable tax, followed by personal income, which is a bit more susceptible to fluctuations in the stock market. And severance taxes and corporate income taxes are reliably the most volatile. Of course, this doesn't always hold. Many states saw their sales tax revenues hit pretty hard due to the economic impacts of COVID. This chart here from Q shows state tax volatility scores over the last 20 years. And you can see that states at the top, like Alaska, North Dakota, and Wyoming, experience much more volatility than your average state because of their reliance on severance taxes. Nevada's score was just slightly above the national average, 5.8, based on their score here. So when we look at the long-term challenges facing tax systems, an ever-present issue is the extent to which that they have not adequately kept pace with changes in the economy. And Chair Neal, you were talking about modernization. That's exactly right. That's often the way it goes with tax policy. It's an ongoing game of playing catch up, and the need for modernization never really ends. There are many trends that are affecting the relevance of major state tax categories. And I'll run through some of the major ones that states have been dealing with here. But first, quick tax tidbit. Did you know that if you live in New Mexico and make it to age 100, you can stop paying income tax. You just can't be claimed as a dependent by anyone else. So just a fun fact there. They're the only state that does something like that. Little incentive to keep on keeping on. In any case, the sales tax faces some of the most difficult barriers to modernization. And it's a tax that has been gradually eroded over time due to a number of factors. For tax policy purists, the ideal sales tax would fall on all final final consumption, but state sales taxes do not really live up to that ideal. A growing number of consumer purchases are not subject to sales tax in most states. It's not that easy to see, but this chart that I have up shows personal consumption of goods compared to services over all the way back to the early 1900s. Back in the 1930s, when most states adopted their sales taxes, tangible goods accounted for most personal consumption, and services were left out of tax bases because they posed some trickier administrative challenges, and those exemptions just weren't nearly as expensive. But today, services account for about 70% of all personal consumption, and many of those transactions are not subject to sales tax. The digital era has also contributed to an eroding sales tax base. Many tangible objects are being replaced by intangible versions, not a new trend that, instead of people buying a book at a bookstore, people are downloading books onto their Kindles. But only half the states still tax digital products or streaming services. And there's been a continuing shift towards electronic commerce as well, which accelerated through the pandemic. Online sales are now almost 20% of total retail spending. And very recently, we've seen all the sales tax states enact laws allowing for the collection of tax from remote vendors, but there's still exemptions in every state for smaller sellers and ongoing challenges with bringing foreign sellers into compliance. So still some revenue left on the table there. And then in addition to all these challenges, you have your legislatively enacted exemptions and sales tax holidays that further cut into sales tax revenues. Most states exempt groceries, things like prescription medication. Corporate income tax has also been gradually eroded and has declined as a source of revenue over the years. It used to be about 9 to 10% of state tax collections in the early 80s. Now it's about half of that. Some of the commonly cited reasons for this include an increase in tax planning opportunities, growth in economic development incentives, and there's also been an ongoing shift of pass-through businesses and S corporations filing through the income tax code, or personal income tax code, which had more favorable treatment at the federal level until recently, until the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed. So roughly 90% of American businesses are now pass-throughs. And changes in the apportionment formulas that states use to determine tax liability for multi-state corporate taxpayers, they've been increasingly altered in ways that benefit corporations that have a lot of payroll and property in state and a lot of sales out of state. And then, of course, there are challenges facing most categories, just running through some of the major ones. Personal income taxes, for example, usually based on where you are physically located when you perform your income generating activities. So increased rates of teleworking are creating a number of administrative and compliance challenges, especially in populous border regions where workers who may have lived in one state and commuted into another for work are suddenly working from home. So states are vying over who gets to tax that income and trying to answer questions on where should employers withhold for an employee. Property taxation, a large part of the value created in the modern economy involves less tangible things like financial assets or bits and bytes. And real property ownership is a little less connected to wealth. So the tax is not closely tied to the ability to pay principal as it once was. And then, furthermore, the cut the cord phenomenon, folks switching to streaming services, also challenging local franchise fee revenues. Old news that the gas tax is eroding with increased levels of fuel efficiency and growth in electric vehicles. Gambling taxes have been struggling for a while. There's been an explosion of sports betting, but there's been also ongoing concern about the lack of appeal of traditional casino games among younger people. Many states still don't have online gaming, and the pandemic was particularly difficult for the casino industry. Severance taxes, obviously highly volatile with changes in energy prices, and then tourism, tourist taxes, lodging, meals, the rise of short-term rentals, car and ride sharing, delivery platforms. Those have all presented states with many new regulatory and tax questions, and created some challenges for existing tax categories like hotel, lodging, car rentals, meals, taxes. So that's a broad overview of some of the long-term fiscal challenges states are facing. And of course, the most recent fiscal challenge came from the COVID-19 pandemic. State revenues took a pretty serious hit in 2020, and forecasts were exceedingly negative going into 2021. So it seemed like some of these tax challenges might become even more pressing going into last year. But towards the beginning of 2020, or I guess towards the end of 2020, economic conditions started to pick up more than anticipated, and there was another round of federal funding for states in the form of the American Rescue Plan Act. So states were suddenly in a pretty strong fiscal position for the most part, with legislative offices reporting to us that they were experiencing positive revenue growth and had cautious optimism about their future fiscal situations. In fact, states like California, Idaho, Maryland, Minnesota have announced significant budget surpluses going into 2022. I wouldn't necessarily say it's all clear skies ahead. A lot of that robust growth is attributable to those one-time federal transfers. And while year-over-year growth from 2020 to 2021 was quite strong, you have to consider the starting point. The states were in a recession in 2020. So compared to 2020, revenue growth was great, but compared to the pre-pandemic situation, it's not quite as robust. The recession did have a very uneven impact on states and localities. There are still some concerns around things like employment participation rates and inflation, and state employment too. I was reading a report from the Tax Policy Center that noted that as recently as October 2021, state and local governments still employed nearly 1 million fewer people than they did before the pandemic. But things are looking pretty good at the moment, and historically speaking, states have been more likely to make tax changes that will result in an increase in revenue during and after recessions, and they're more likely to cut taxes when times are better. So this improved fiscal outlook really set the stage for a lot of different types of tax relief efforts in 2021. So I'll get into some of those next. But another fun fact before I get into that, did you know roughly 7 million children disappeared after the passage of a 1985 tax law? But it's not as bad as it seems. What happened was that taxpayers used to not have to submit a social security number for their dependents. So many claimed fake children to get a deduction. When a new law passed requiring social security numbers, some 7 million fewer dependents were claimed the next year, according to IRS data. But getting into our 2021 tax trends, NCSL sends out surveys to the state legislative fiscal offices to keep track of all significant revenue changes that have been enacted throughout the year. Thank you to Russell for submitting Nevada's. We're still waiting on a few states to submit before we can put out the report for 2021, but we do have a pretty comprehensive picture of what happened last year, which also contains many hints about what we might see from states this year as well. Most significant trend revenue-wise was that 11 states enacted measures to reduce personal and or corporate income tax rates. This slide provides a list of all of them. Some of these reductions were pretty modest, but others were estimated to reduce revenues by hundreds of millions annually. And cutting income taxes is a continuation of a long-standing trend that was put on hold once the pandemic hit. Coming out of the Great Recession, we saw at least 14 states cut income tax rates, and that trend continued long into the recovery, with 6 states cutting income taxes in both 2018 and 2019. The income tax cuts in recent years have often been paired with offsetting sales tax base broadening efforts, but in 2021, that was generally not the case. There were many other more targeted forms of tax relief. In addition to rate cuts, on the individual side of things, we saw many states provide for some kind of preferential treatment of coronavirus relief payments, as well as unemployment insurance benefits for a limited period of time as well. Georgia provided a $140 million tax cut in the form of an increased standard deduction. Nebraska approved a phase out of income taxes on Social Security income. We also saw quite a few states take action to increase the value of their earned income tax credits or child tax credits, or implement new ones, which are generally geared towards low income taxpayers. There were some notable variations to this approach as well. Washington is a state that doesn't have an income tax, so to create an alternative to the EITC, the state enacted a sales tax remittance program using federal earned income tax credit eligibility. California also enacted a Golden State Stimulus tax rebate program, which provided a $600 payment per tax return for recipients of the state earned income tax credit. Both of those were pretty substantial relief programs. Idaho and New Mexico also created similar but smaller rebate programs for certain taxpayers. And then we saw a handful of states create new sales tax holidays like Arkansas, Florida, and Tennessee. Relief for businesses, particularly small businesses, was also a priority in many states in 2021. One prominent issue has been whether states would conform to the tax treatment of the Paycheck Protection Loan Program that was included in the CARES Act. The federal government determined that the loans weren't taxable, and also that expenses funded by those loans were deductible for income tax purposes. And this was a bit more of a headache when states were more pessimistic about their budget conditions, since allowing that double tax benefit was pretty costly. About $500 billion in those PPP loans would translate to billions in deductible expenses, but states generally conformed to the federal treatment. At least 13 states passed legislation to do so in 2021. And then there's also been a recent rise in new entity level taxes for S corporations ever since the federal government capped the deduction for state and local income, sales, and property taxes as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. At the start of this year, 7 states had adopted these new entity level taxes, which are fully deductible at the federal level, and then created offsetting state income tax credits, which is a way to provide relief for businesses that can fully deduct those expenses at the federal level. And then this year we saw another 14 additional states pass legislation to create these new SALT cap workarounds for their pass-through businesses. For the most part, businesses are able to elect whether they want to be taxed in this manner. I think Connecticut is the only state that made it mandatory. And then we also had, many states report continued action surrounding other federal tax changes, such as conforming to expanded deductions for net operating losses, or continuing to respond to changes that were contained in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act way back in 2017. And then finally, on the business relief front, tax credits, quite a few states expanded or created new job creation or investment tax credit programs. There's also been a surge in expanded or new film tax incentives, which had been falling out in favor in recent years due to questions about their effectiveness, but it seems states are trying to bolster that industry after a tough period of time for entertainment production. And on the tax cut note, probably worth mentioning that there was some hubbub around the ability of states to provide tax relief. And it is ongoing since the ARPA funds for the states came with strings attached, including a clawback provision that restricts states' ability to use federal funds to offset reductions in tax revenue. That law and subsequent rules issued by the Treasury say that any point between the ARPA enactment date and the end of 2024, a state that takes action to reduce net revenues by more than 1% against a baseline, which is fiscal 2019 tax revenue indexed for inflation. They need to be able to specify how that revenue loss will be offset, either through spending cuts, tax increases, economic growth, or else they could be required to repay funds to the federal government. 20 states are part of 6 lawsuits that have been filed against this provision. But it has not really prevented them from implementing tax cuts. And there have been a few rulings issued, including ones that clarified that lawmakers in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio could enact state tax cuts while accepting ARPA funds. A couple other federal district court judges have upheld the restriction on tax cuts with appeals pending. My limited understanding of this is that there's not much of a significant fiscal impact tied to these cases beyond protecting states from future federal encroachment, because states are generally experiencing enough revenue growth to offset whatever tax reductions they've enacted or are currently considering. It's not looking likely that they'll fall below that baseline established by ARPA in the near future. And Treasury guidance doesn't suggest that they're looking to be aggressive in recouping any of those funds. So moving along to new taxes and other revenue increases that have occurred over the last year. Excise taxes were pretty popular in 2021, cannabis and sports betting in particular. Those were both trendy topics leading into the year and continue to receive a good deal of attention. 5 states passed legislation to legalize and tax marijuana in 2021, bringing the total number of states that have done so to 19 plus DC. Montana also passed legislation to implement an adult use marijuana tax structure in the wake of a legalization ballot measure that was approved by voters the year before. And then another 9 states passed measures to implement sports betting or expand to mobile gaming offerings. Colorado and Missouri passed measures to increase gas taxes, and Connecticut imposed a new per mile highway usage excise tax on heavy commercial vehicles. States like California and Maryland and Indiana created new taxes on e-cigarettes and vaping products. Then leading up to the pandemic, probably the most significant tax trend was the implementation of laws to require internet retailers to collect sales and use taxes through economic nexus laws and laws requiring marketplace facilitators or entities that facilitate sales for third-party sellers like Amazon or eBay to collect taxes on those sales as well. Most of the sales tax states had already implemented these going into 2021, but the 3 remaining holdouts, Florida, Missouri, and Kansas, all passed legislation to join the fold. And now that they have these laws in place, a growing number of states are expanding the definition of a marketplace facilitator or looking to require marketplace facilitators to collect other kinds of taxes that are applied on certain transactions, such as lodging taxes or E911 fees. A handful of states increased taxes on higher earners. New York and DC did so. The legislature in Massachusetts approved a constitutional amendment that will go to voters to create a new millionaire's tax. Washington State, again, a state without an income tax, created a new capital gains tax that's estimated to generate about $500 million through the next fiscal year. A few states also shored up revenue from business taxes in various ways. Nevada's on this list for the new tax they imposed on certain mineral mining parties. And then one of the more hotly debated areas of tax policy this year was in the digital taxation realm, with certain tech and social media companies performing quite well through the recent economic downturn. There were several states that proposed various types of taxes that aim to get at some of the profits being generated by the data economy. These include a lot of different types of proposals, like sales taxes on digital advertisements, gross receipts taxes on the revenues derived from digital advertising services, excise taxes on data collectors based on the number of consumers the companies collect data on per month. At least 9 states proposed something along these lines, but the only state that passed anything was Maryland, which took the gross receipts tax approach. That was quickly challenged and is currently being litigated. And basically the question is whether it's constitutional to subject digital advertising to different tax treatment than regular advertising. But some of the other proposals don't necessarily come with the same legal questions. But in any case, the revenue potential of these taxes is pretty significant. Maryland estimated that their digital advertising measure would generate up to 120 million annually by fiscal year 2025. And it seems like some of the states might be waiting to see what comes of the legal battle before taking further action. That process could take a while. So I think, this will probably be an area of interest in 2022, but some states may not feel the pressure to rush into anything given their relatively strong budget situations. So getting into 2022, but first, final non sequitur, did you know astronaut Jack Swigert, the command module pilot for Apollo 13, got the assignment at the last minute because of health concerns surrounding another astronaut. And in the rush, he neglected to file his taxes. According to a transcript of the moment he realized his mistake, the crew on the ground thought he was joking, but he was seriously asking how he could file an extension. He was played by Kevin Bacon in the movie. So what else might we see on the tax front in 2022? Heading into 2021, I was predicting that we'd see a ton of tax increases from states in light of serious revenue concerns at the time, which left me feeling a little silly after the picture changed so dramatically. But I'll try again. It's kind of fun to make predictions when you can't be proven wrong immediately. I'd say given states' strong fiscal positions and combined with this year being an election year, I think it's safe to say that we'll see tax relief continue to be a top priority, and the income tax cutting trend will continue. There are several states, including Georgia, North Carolina, West Virginia, Mississippi, that have been seriously talking about completely scrapping their personal or corporate income tax, which no state has succeeded in doing for decades. Quite a few more states have proposed a reduction in marginal income tax rates in their annual State of State speeches. So to the extent that these cuts are driven primarily by one-time revenue surpluses, some of these are pretty dramatic reductions, and it seems like those states could risk getting a little over their skis. Many states did have to tap into reserve funds in 2020, and if revenue growth doesn't continue, they could find themselves in a bit more vulnerable positions. But based on how states have been spending their ARPA dollars,
You are the first person to join the conference. You are the first person to join the conference. You are the first person to join the conference.
because it's really eating into.
You are in the meeting now.
We had these wage gains, right? These one drop in stimulus payments to folks. But now that, prices of goods are increasing, I mean, it's eating into that wage gain. And so at the end of the day, right, when you say like a group that are in poverty kind of made it a little ways ahead, now when they go grocery shopping or any other thing, housing, food, gas, all of those things are then increasing and then eating into the money that they say that would be a surplus. And so I think that we do have to have a deeper conversation about that, because we might find out at the end of this cycle that, folks are back in the same position. So.
Yeah.
Chair, we are ready and we are reconnecting again. So I will go ahead and unmute us. So if you can please stand by 1 second. Chair, you are now unmuted to the broadcast and you may call your meeting back to order.
Okay, thank you, BPS. So Mr. Brainerd, I guess we'll go back to your last slide so you can finish the presentation.
Yes, let me find my place here.
And to let everyone know, Senator Dennis has joined us.
Okay, I think this is where I was regarding the taxation of digital products. And this is becoming an increasingly consequential topic from a fiscal standpoint. Non-taxable digital products are increasingly replacing similar taxable tangible products or traditional communication services. And people are opting for streaming services rather than cable or cloud computing over box software. A slew of states have expanded their sales tax to digital goods and streaming video within the last few years, states like Arkansas, Connecticut, DC, Iowa, Maryland. So that could be part of how states make up for income tax reductions. This chart takes a look specifically at sales taxes on streaming services. Again, states and localities have seen revenue streams from cable companies decline because streaming services do not use rights of way for which localities charge other providers. Some jurisdictions tax streaming service providers through another provision of the tax code. 26 states currently impose sales and use tax on it. In a couple of states, it's only taxable again if the end user has a right to permanent use. And then this map from the Federation of Tax Administrators shows the number of services that states tax out of 176 included in the survey. I talked about this earlier. Services now account for 70% of personal consumption. The results of this survey show that there are only 5 states that can be said to tax services broadly: Hawaii, New Mexico, South Dakota, Washington, and West Virginia. We've seen several states extend their sales taxes to specific services over the past few years, things like health clubs, laundry cleaners, but states that have attempted to expand their sales tax to services broadly have historically found it quite challenging. Several have tried and failed after major pushback in recent years. And then I think we'll also continue to see states legalizing adult use marijuana, sports betting, online gambling. Excise tax increases tend to be a little bit more politically palatable. So to the extent that any states need to raise revenue around the edges, excise taxes tend to be a fairly low-hanging fruit. And again, there are platforms and other challenges facing these tax categories that states may look to address. Then a few more issues that might come up. Property tax. Several states are discussing property tax relief in light of rising housing prices. There's also been a little chatter in a few states struggling with affordable housing about implementing taxes on second homes or looking to nonprofits for local revenue. Corporate apportionment, there may be some increased attention paid to state apportionment formulas for corporate taxpayers, and more debates and attention paid towards market-based sourcing and when states can assert nexus for corporate income tax purposes. And then the new entity level taxes as workarounds to the federal cap on state and local deductions will probably continue to grow in the absence of any federal activity. The IRS could potentially change its position, and there are still talks surrounding the potential elimination of the SALT cap as part of the Build Back Better package. So assuming these taxes do continue to grow, there might be calls for states to devote more effort to uniformity, since these taxes tend to vary slightly by state. And then, of course, responding to other types of federal activity. The Build Back Better proposal contains a large number of tax provisions that would require state attention. So if there is movement on that, it will be undoubtedly a top issue this year. And on that note, I'll wrap it up. Happy to answer any questions if you've got them. And if you have any questions in the future about what other states are doing on any particular fiscal items that are of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or our fiscal affairs team, and we're happy to do some research for you all. That's what we're here for. So I'll check you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. I know we had a question from Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Neal, and thank you, Mr. Brainerd, for the detailed PowerPoint along with the little speed bump there in the middle. So you did a great job towards the end there. So thank you so much for that information. I do have two questions, and the first one has to do from slide 23, and it was again repeated in slide 30, and it has to do with the sales tax base broadening. Was that an increase of the sales tax, or was that there would be additional services that were going to be sales taxed? And I realize that these are all proposals in other states, but just was wondering if there's a way to possibly go a little bit deeper into that, what sales tax base broadening really meant.
Sure, and Chair Neal, Assembly Member Anderson, that's removing an exemption for something that is currently exempt from sales tax, not creating a new tax on them or something. So you know, I listed a few specific digital services. Most states specifically exempt, trying to get my wording right. Most states do provide a specific list of exemptions, and the states that do tax services broadly tend to have a list of do the opposite, have a list of everything that is taxable. And so that's why there haven't been so many states that have expanded to services, because it's a little bit more difficult just based on the way their statutes were initially written.
If I may follow up, Chair Neal.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for that clarification. That helped me out a lot. Really, removing the exemptions totally makes sense. So that helped me out tremendously with understanding that a little bit more. My second question is actually not part of that same slide, so I'm just going to jump in. It has to do with slide 28 and the excise taxes. From your analysis of these, or from your guys' discussion about these excise taxes, were they being proposed as revenue generating, or as trying to get people to stop those vices, for lack of a better term? Most of the time that kind of is what happened with the tobacco and or some of the other items that have been used in the past for the excise tax. So I don't know if you guys did that deep of a dive into the.
Yeah, there's kind of a contradiction, isn't there, in terms of, you know, you impose the tobacco tax to dissuade, but then you become kind of reliant on the revenue. Especially marijuana, I think the goal is, in addition to, the benefits of decriminalization, revenue is the goal. With e-cigarettes, those just have not been taxed, so that most of the states are establishing new taxes on those. So disincentivizing consumption is probably part of the goal, and they don't raise that much revenue in the big picture. The e-cigarette taxes don't, but in general, I'd say the excise tax increases were for revenue rather than to
Great. And
dissuade.
thank you so much for that clarification, because I do think that's a much better term of dissuading as opposed to the other thing. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chair Neal, for that much time.
You're welcome. Any additional questions? Vice Chair Cohen.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Getting back to that same slide with the excise taxes, I was kind of surprised to see transportation kind of mixed in with the sin taxes, let's say. Is that transportation as in flights, or people who are taking, taxes on taking the bus? Like generally, what is that with transportation?
Vice Chair Cohen, it's generally gas tax increases, just increases the motor fuel rate. And it's not a sin tax, but it just included for census reporting, and the way we use selective sales tax categories, we lump motor fuel in with the other sin taxes. But yeah, the two states I mentioned were increases in the motor fuel tax rate.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Okay, so I just had one. It's more broad. I wanted to go back to the federal one-time transfers, because I am of the opinion that, well, I have a couple opinions, but because I was a part of the 2011 cycle recession. And so I really felt at the time we relied heavily on federal government relief rather than actually focusing on what should our state budgets be doing, right? And how we should be solidifying our tax base for the next wave, right? And making sure that we're proactive versus having the mindset, oh, we're in a crisis, we should tax. Because I think that that's the wrong approach. And I also think that we have created kind of a, I guess, a cultural mindset that the most appropriate time to tax or to adjust your taxing system is in the middle of a crisis. And I actually disagree with that. I actually believe that we should plan for our future and make sure that we have enough revenue coming in for our services and how we're growing to make sure that it's sustainable. And because we had the stimulus dollars flow into our budget, and now everybody's just like, oh, we're sitting pretty. That's not it's not, to me, I see it as not our money, right? It wasn't money that we generated. It wasn't money that we produced. It was money that was then given that ultimately in the federal landscape has to be paid back by a taxpayer anyway. And so I wanted to see how we should really treat these one-time buffers, and how should states, specifically Nevada, start to plan around our tax revenue, because we really still are planning for the future, and we really still are trying to make sure that we have enough money to pay for the services that are continuing to grow, absent of the federal stimulus dollars. And I just wanted to hear a perspective on that.
Sure. Chairman, I agree. I think the best time to do the work of modernization is probably when you're in a better position rather than when it is an emergency. I think I mentioned earlier, the historical trend is to wait until you're in a budget crisis to try to do, tax stuff, and that makes it more difficult. So, I mean, I guess that's just the political nature around having, a better budgeting situation, is that people are less inclined to take up the tough long-term stuff that needs to be addressed at some point. But I wouldn't ignore the federal money, but I would be would be careful about, acknowledging, to what extent is our current fiscal situation driven by those one-time funds, and where would we be if not for those? And looking to the future, that there are many difficult fiscal issues that states have not addressed for a very long time, and so now would be a great time to do that if muster the urgency, I guess.
Thank you for that. I know I kind of just dragged you into one of my own particular political opinions, but I appreciate you going along for that ride. So we will go ahead and shift. Thank you for that presentation and giving us your time today. And if you ever present again, throw in an inflation tidbit for me.
Will do.
All right, and so
Thanks
we will
so
go
much.
ahead and move to agenda item number 6, which is the presentation on the tax changes approved in the 2021 session. So we went kind of broad national, now we're going local to state. So Mr. Gendon.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Russell Gendon, Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. And so I have the next agenda item, and so let me attempt to start sharing my screen here. And this would be on the meeting packet for this group. Sorry, I've got to move the meeting window here. And so, Madam Chair and members of the committee, as we were working with the chair to set up this first meeting, what the fiscal staff thought in working with the chair was to sort of present information on the state's general fund revenue and somewhat from the context of the Economic Forum as the body that's responsible for forecasting the state's general fund revenue that's used in the budgeting process. And so, especially we have Senator Tatro as a new member of the committee, so he may be aware of some of this, but perhaps not. But also thought it might be a good refresher for all the other members to go through some of this. This is sort of about as good as I can display it on my screen. I will try and blow it up here, if that helps. Whoops. Did it just disappear? Yeah, I don't know what happened.
That's a good size. I mean, I know it's better.
We'll see how long this will hang. Okay, I don't know what happened. I think my laptop is just trying to resize. Okay. So again, with Senator Tatro being a new member, and some of you've seen this. So what I have here is what you hear us refer to as, this is the Economic Forum's General Fund Revenue Forecasting. So this is the set of tables that documents all of the state's unrestricted general fund revenue sources that the Economic Forum is responsible for forecasting, and is, for those as you recall as returning members of the committee, the Economic Forum is a statutory body that is required for preparing forecasts on or before December 3rd of odd-numbered years that are required to be used by the governor in even-numbered years to be used by the governor in developing the budget that he submits to the legislature before the beginning of session. Then the Economic Forum is also required by statute to revise the forecast if necessary on or before May 1st of the odd-numbered years. And then that's the forecast that's used by the legislature in the general fund budget process during session. But what we realized sort of the staff is there's another part of this Economic Forum forecasting or general fund revenue forecasting process that possibly as staff, we don't go through with our legislators as we do with the Economic Forum. And so to go through a little bit of that today so that legislators understand what is occurring. And so part of that will be is right? The Economic Forum is required to do its forecast on or before May 1st during session. Clearly, session does not sine die till after that. So there can be legislative actions that are approved by the legislature and signed by the governor that can affect these general fund revenue sources. Thus, that has to be taken into account in the general fund revenue forecast and in these economic forums. So what you see here, as I stated, is the economic revenue forecast tables. And I don't plan on going through all of them. I just wanted, some of you have seen them, some of you have not with regards, these are the tables. And so let me just go through them. And so, sorry. And so then these other tables are, along with the table that I just went through, they're tables that we're preparing and to document what's occurring as we move from the Economic Forum doing its forecast under current law, and then the legislature approving actions that affect revenues. And so again, I'm not going to go all through these, but also to, I guess, sort of throw out a little bit of plug for the Fiscal Analysis Division. These tables are included in the Appropriations Report document that is prepared by the Fiscal Analysis Division, which documents the legislative session from the budget and revenue perspective. And so this table 1 that you're seeing, it's just simply a table that staff had to put together to try and document the tax credits. Because beginning in the 2013 session, we had a couple tax credit programs get approved, additional ones in 2015. And so as those tax credit programs started to become effective and we would see them working in the real world, we realized then we had to come up with a process to be able to handle the tax credits within the Economic Forum's general fund revenue forecasting process, and within the budget process for those general fund revenues to be able to document them, track them, and forecast them. And so then table 2 is a table that I'm going to go past and then come back to. But this is the one where we document the legislative actions. But what I thought might be a good place for the members of this committee today is to go through these are additional pages from the 2021 Appropriations Report prepared by the Fiscal Analysis Division. And so these tables are included in a couple pages at the beginning of the Appropriations Report. And so what I thought I would just walk through for the Economic Forum members here is the table that at the top of the table here, it shows the Economic Forum's general fund revenue forecast that was approved by the Economic Forum at their December 3rd meeting. And so this would have been the general fund revenue forecast that Governor Sisolak used for his budget. Then here in the middle block here, you can see this would be the Economic Forum's May 2021 forecast, but it now includes adjustments for legislative actions approved by the legislature during the 21 session. But we also this time have this additional unique element, which is we had to make adjustments for the Supreme Court's decision that occurred during session regarding the MBT tax, the modified business tax, and the bill from the 2019 session. So then what you can see here then is the difference by fiscal year. And so you can see that, as you heard during session, that the Economic Forum at the May 21 meeting had a fairly significant upward revision to the forecast from December. And again, I'll just remind everybody, forecasters are trying to forecast in a pandemic, and none of us have much experience, if any, doing that. So it's been an interesting and yet difficult exercise. But the additional revenue net between what the forum added in their forecast process, the legislative actions, and the court decisions, was you can see over these 3 fiscal years of approximately $235.8 million in FY21, $310 million in FY2022, and 327.4 million in FY23 for a total of approximately 873.4 million. It was the net upward revision of the May forecast that was being used to drive the legislatively approved general fund budget compared to the revenue estimates for the general fund that were available to be used by the governor for the budget he submitted. So then I thought to be able to try and document this and then walk the committee members through the various changes and then get to the impact of the court decision on the modified business tax. So what you can see here then is we can parse the results from the previous table into the change due to the economic forum, the change due to the legislatively approved actions during the session, and those from the court decision. So again, when we're looking at things forecasting, we're trying to forecast what we believe collections will be from taxes before the tax credits. And then we separately forecast and treat the tax credits and subtract them to get the net after tax credit revenue that would be available for budget purposes. So you can see here that the first lines are here documenting the change in the May forecast to the December forecast due to what we'll just call it's the economic forum. And that would have been due to the outlook and the information set in May was different than December. That resulted in upward revisions to the forecast. And some of you, if you go to the bottom line here, the total difference after tax credits, you may recall from session or reading in the newspaper that the Economic Forum added this approximately $910 million in additional general fund revenue from the May forecast compared to the December forecast. So again, that was the amount where the forms forecast compared May, December under current statute. So then what you had is there were changes to general fund revenue sources and or the addition of new general fund revenue sources during the 2021 session. Those are included in the legislatively approved changes. And you can see that was estimated to be approximately $83.8 million in FY 2022 and $81.3 million in FY 23 for a total of $165.1 million for the biennium before the tax credits. And then there's an additional tax credits added to the Educational Choice Scholarship Tax Credit Program that is expected to have the negative impact for the tax credit program in FY23 of approximately $4.7 million. So again, you go down here by fiscal year and you can see the net change due to the legislatively approved actions here for the both years, FY22 and FY23 of approximately $160.4 million. I will go through that more when I back up and go through table 2 as to what those legislatively approved actions were. So then you can see the bottom line here of each of these blocks is the court decision related to the modified business tax, which resulted in refund and interest for the period of FY 2020 and FY 21 due to the taxpayers paying at the higher rate, which the Supreme Court ended up then upholding the lower court's decision that those provisions of a bill from the 2019 session were unconstitutional. And also out of that court decision then came that we had to then lower the tax rates for FY22 and FY23. So that's what you can see here then is the estimate of the court decisions of approximately $87.7 million in FY21 in terms of a downward reduction of approximately $55.3 million in FY22 and $53.7 million in FY23 for a total of approximately $196.6 million. So you can see then the downward revisions over the 3 years due to the court decisions were more than the legislatively approved changes for the estimates that were produced. So then the itemize and allow the members of the committee to see table 3 of this page. And again, these are pages from the Appropriations Report, is documenting the numbers that are reflected up in table 2, specifically related to the modified business tax and the impact of the Supreme Court's decision on May 13th, upholding the First Judicial District's Court's decision that the 4 sections of SB 551 from the 2019 session relating to the modified business tax rates and what we refer to as this modified business tax rate reduction calculation that came out of the 2015 legislation that created the commerce tax and made changes to the modified business. And so, sorry, I just went to pop up that. So you can see here then that the results of the MBT court decision resulted in refunds and interest. The refunds and interest are coming from the, for FY 2020, all 4 quarters, and the first 3 quarters of FY 2021, modified business taxpayers paid at the higher rate established by SB 551 from the 2019 session, where under the court's ruling, they should have paid then at the lower rate prior to the passage of SB 551. And so the Fiscal Analysis Division staff working with the Department of Taxation staff, who is actually administering the modified business tax and then administering the refunds and interest here, these are the estimates of the refund and interest. So again, this is refunds and interest that the Department of Taxation has to provide to modified business taxpayers that made payments in the 4 quarters of FY 2020 and the first 3 quarters of FY 21. So you can see the estimated amount by each of the MBT tax components. So we're estimating it's a total of approximately $75.6 million in refunds and interest for FY 2021, and then approximately $4.7 million in FY 2022, or an estimated total of approximately $80.3 million. I think for this refund and interest portion, we work with Department of Taxation to stay informed on this. I think at possibly one of the future meetings of this committee, we can work with Chair Neal to bring information back to the committee on what the actual refunds and interest are compared to what we were estimating based on when these estimates had to be prepared after the conclusion of the 2021 session. And then here you have the estimated impact due to the tax rate reduction. And so there is an impact in FY 2021 from the tax rate reduction because the Department of Taxation was able to effectuate the tax rate reduction beginning April 1st, 2021, which is the 4th quarter of FY 2021. And so we have to estimate the impact of that on the economic forums forecast, which was done at the higher rates compared to what we would believe will now be generated at the lower tax rates due to, again, the court decision. That's estimated to be approximately $12.1 million in FY 21, as you can see here. And then approximately $50.6 million total for the MBT in FY 2022 and $53.7 million approximately for FY 23, or a total of approximately $116.4 million. So then the bottom block here just brings together the refund and interest and rate reduction component. And for reference here, the modified business tax in non-financial businesses, that tax rate went from 1.475%, as you can see down here in note 4, to 1.378 on any quarterly taxable wages exceeding $50,000 per quarter. And then the tax rate for the mining businesses and the financial businesses went from 2% down to 1.853%. And again, these lower rates came out of what's called the MBT rate reduction calculation. And this is a provision that in the 2015 legislation that with the creation of the new commerce tax and increases in the modified business tax rates says that the Department of Taxation on or before September 30th of each even numbered years must do this calculation based on the actual collections for the preceding even numbered fiscal year to determine whether or not the actual collections from the commerce tax, the modified business tax, and the branch bank excise tax just gets lumped in there to the statutory provisions, whether the actual collections from those three taxes exceed the economic forms forecast by more than 4%. If that statement is true, that the actual collections do exceed the forecast by more than 4%, then there's a calculation that's done through the statutory provisions to proportionally reduce the modified business tax rates such that the amount of revenue generated would have been 4% more than the forecast for those three revenue sources. And so that calculation was done by the Department of Taxation in September 2018 for FY 2018. And then it determined these lower rates, which then were to become effective July 1st, 2019 for FY 2020. It was the actions of the SB 551 from the 2019 session then that changed that the rate reduction rates would not become effective and the rate reduction calculation would go away. The rate reduction calculation has also been restored through the Supreme Court's decision. And so just for the information set of this committee members is this September, on or before September 30th, year of September 2022, the Department of Taxation will have to do this MBT rate reduction calculation based on how the actual collections for FY 2022 end up comparing to the economic forms forecast adjusted for these legislative actions in the court decisions as forecast for FY 2022. So that's the information that I just thought to go through here as to walk the members of this committee through this process that occurs after the economic forum does their forecast on current law, and then us having as staff, as your legislative staff, being also staff to the economic forum. And so you can see the overlap of our responsibilities as sort of revenue staff between the economic forum process and the legislative process and the legislative budget process with regard to accounting for the general fund revenue sources from a forecast and an actual basis. So then what I'd like to do is
Russell,
yeah.
I want to, members, do you have any questions before he goes further? Is that everybody saying no? Okay, because I know it's a lot, so I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I am moving back up. And this one I may have to shrink down a little bit. So hopefully you can bring it up on your screen. And I agree with the chair that this is a lot of information. It's really, as I've stated, some of the same information that was presented to the Economic Forum, these next several agenda items. But we thought it would be a pretty good context for the members of this committee to set the stage for meetings going forward. So what I've backed up to table 2, which of the Economic Forum's packet. And so maybe to try and help the members, sorry, I'm on two different screens. It's on page 21 of the meeting packet in the lower right-hand corner. So this is the table where, again, staff documents the legislative actions that ended up having an impact or could have an impact on general fund revenue sources, unrestricted general fund revenue sources that are included or will be included since they're new into the Economic Forum general fund revenue forecast table. So the first one you can see listed here is what was the new tax that was approved during the 2021 session in AB 495, which is, we're calling it here the mining gross revenue tax on gold and silver. And this was the tax that was established to put a new tax on the gross revenue generated by businesses that are extracting gold and silver in the state of Nevada. And you can see that the way that the tax was set up, that it's an annual tax with these annual revenue thresholds. And so the way the tax works is that on or before April 1st of a year, an entity that's subject to this tax is required to report their gross revenue from the extraction of gold and silver for the immediately preceding calendar year. And then based on that annual amount, then they would determine their amount of taxes. You can see here in the note by the tax bracket, which is the first $20 million of revenue are not taxed. Then anything in excess of 20 million, but less than 150 million is taxed at 0.75%. And then the top bracket is 1.1% of the gross revenue that's in excess of 150 million. So that's the new tax. And thus you can see then the estimates here of approximately $83.8 million that was done by fiscal staff. And also there was analysis being done by Jeremy Guerrero for the Mining Association on this during session. But this is the estimate that the Fiscal Analysis Division staff came up with for this new tax for FY 2022 of approximately $83.8 million. And then basically approximately $81 million you can see there for FY 2023, or a total of $165 million approximately for the biennium. And so this new tax is required to be deposited in the state general fund for its first 2 years, that is FY 2022 and FY 23. Beginning in FY 24, this revenue source is required to be deposited in the state education fund, which is the new fund under the pupil-centered funding plan, where the revenues go into that fund and used to determine the funding amounts for funding K-12 education through the funding plan of the pupil-centered funding plan. So then the next item is you see several listings here for under sales and use tax. And at this point in time, I'm not going to go through each of the elements because I think the important thing here is during the 2021 session, there was the passage of SB 440, which established what we call the Nevada National Guard sales tax holiday. And so this allows Nevada National Guard members to obtain a certificate of exemption, which then they can use to be exempt from all sales taxes during the Nevada Day holiday weekend. And so that's what the sales tax holiday is. You can see we didn't do any estimates for this that you see in the table. We realized that it should have a negative impact on both state and local sales taxes, but we didn't know how to come up with an estimate that we felt comfortable putting on the sheets as a potential revenue reduction. Obviously, the first sales tax holiday has occurred here with the October 21 Nevada Day holiday. It's going to be very difficult for the Department of Taxation to provide us actual information on that, the way that the sales tax reporting works in terms of the sales tax returns. But I think one of the more important things is your staff to just point out here at a high level is since the passage of SB 440, it's come to our attention, and clearly Chair Neal knows this, that the state of Nevada we're a full member of what's called the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, or SUTA. And this is a majority of the states that have sales taxes got together and they have the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement to administer sales taxes. Specifically, it works to help with regards to the administration of online sales taxes, but just sales taxes in general across the states. And so in October of last year, the Streamlined Sales and Tax Governing Board, of which Chair Neal is a member, found that Nevada's sales tax holiday is non-compliant with the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement provisions regarding sales tax holidays. So I just wanted to get that out there because I believe that may be one of the areas that Chair Neal and this committee will want to have additional information presented on. And go into what will be done to get Nevada out of this non-compliant phase that they're in with regards to the Nevada National Guard sales tax holiday. And my conversations with staff with Chair Neal is I don't want to say much more about why we're non-compliant and all that. If there's questions going to be about that, because it's my understanding it's the intent of Chair Neal to, at a future meeting, have an agenda item to go through the sales tax, as well as have staff from the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Governing Board make a presentation on SUTA to the committee, as well as the sales tax holiday provisions and why Nevada is non-compliant and where Nevada can go to try and gain compliance. And so with that, Madam Chair, I will pause there on that one. And if there's anything else you want to add, or if I've adequately addressed that at this point in time. And
thank you, Mr. Gendon. Yeah, I know that, probably some of the members from the Assembly Taxation remember this bill very clearly because there was some hesitation on this particular measure. Well, your instincts were right. I mean, we kind of had similar instincts, but it had to move forward. And so there will be some corrective measures that we will discuss in February around this particular bill. And you will see this bill come back in either as a Senate bill or some other bill, but to handle those corrections. And that's all I'll say about that one.
thank you, Madam Chair. So again, Russell Gendon for the record with the Fiscal Analysis Division. So some of these other ones you'll see listed here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. If there's questions, you can ask them. I can try and address them, or perhaps they can be deferred to going into more detail in a future meeting. But with regards to the live entertainment tax, there was a change made to provide an exemption basically for government entities if the live entertainment is provided by or entirely for the benefit of them. Here, I'm not going to go through this because I already did, but you can see then Table 2 is documenting the reduction to the modified business tax revenue forecast due to the court decision. And then there's you can see SB 9 was a bill making changes to the securities revenue source that the Secretary of State administers. And just again, to provide maybe the members of the Revenue Committee some perspective that this was not a bill that came through the Revenue Committees in either house. So you can see there can be pieces of legislation that are going through other policy committees and they don't come through Senate Revenue and Economic Development or Assembly Revenue, but Michael, Joe, and I as staff again to the legislature and the Economic Forum and that revenue forecast, we have to go account for those bills because they could be potentially affecting an unrestricted general fund revenue source. Thus, lots of times we are aware of them during the legislative session because our Fiscal Analysis Division or Research Division colleagues have let us know that these bills are out there that could be having an impact on an unrestricted general fund revenue source. But sometimes we don't. But Michael, Joe, and I go through all the bills post-session to just try and go through them to see if there's a bill that didn't get on our radar, that did not come through the revenue committees, that we have to pick up and try and account for as impacting. And so this securities is one of those bills. And you can see that the Secretary of State did have a fiscal note with regards to this potential de minimis revenue reduction for that revenue source beginning in FY 2023 of approximately $12,000. At the top of the next page, you can see the short-term car lease is what we call it. And this was SB 389, the bill that required the short-term car lease or car rental tax to be applicable to peer-to-peer car sharing programs. And I think what I would add here to the Vice Chair Cohen's question that she asked Mr. Brainerd from NCSL is this might have been part of the context from her memory from last session that because we actually we have a tax that's not on the peer-to-peer but it's called the Transportation Connection Excise Tax. That's what we call it on the economic forum sheets. But that's the tax that people like Uber and Lyft are, as well as taxis and those entities are required to collect 3% excise tax on the amount of the charge and remit that to the state for deposit in the state general fund. So I just thought I would mention that we literally have this thing called the Transportation Connection Excise Tax on our sheets. And when you see Mr. Brainerd calling it a transportation services under excise taxes, then in our vernacular, I think there's a connection. But so this was going back to the peer-to-peer, you can see that Mr. Brainerd also had a slide where he was listing states that had peer-to-peer, and Nevada wasn't there. I consider this to probably be like those other states. And so what this is doing, what's peer-to-peer car sharing programs? Think Turo, right? Turo is this platform where people can go rent their own cars to other people on this platform. And so it's been something that's been discussed, I think, for the last few sessions. And in the 2021 session, Senator Neal actually had a bill to bring the peer-to-peer car sharing programs like Turo and others that are allowing the rental of cars, no different than the rental of cars by a Hertz or Budget or that, to be subject to the short-term car rental tax, which is 10% of the rental charge with some potential allowances statewide, and that's the general fund portion, the 10% rate. And in Clark and Washoe, there's an additional 2% that's imposed on these peer-to-peer car sharing programs because it's the same 2% tax rate that would be imposed on car rental companies, that is like Hertz and Budget renting cars. So in some sense, I look at this as your fiscal tax revenue staff coming under this construct of the modernization of your tax code, that you have the economy's changing in this peer-to-peer or this sharing economy, that activity is occurring that is no different than what's being carried on by businesses that are being required to possibly be licensed or register and then collect and remit taxes. And so this was one of those bills that I think tried to get the same treatment for entities that are renting cars in the state of Nevada to other people. This professional employee organization fee, it was a thing that was just brought to our attention by a fiscal colleague as to a revenue source that was supposed to be going to the state general fund and inadvertently was not. So we had picked it up in the May forecast. We just had to move it. So you're going to see the plus 103,500 here and see us subtract it off on the next page because we had to move it from one general ledger account to another. And then these repayments, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. They're just simply where the legislature approves that a general fund appropriation be provided to a program or generally their projects. And then that general fund appropriation is required to be repaid back to the general fund. And lots of times these are for technology type projects or other maintenance type projects. And so if there are questions on that, I will have to probably phone a fiscal colleague to answer it because it's more of a budget thing, but it is filtered through as a general fund revenue repayment when the appropriation is repaid. Finally, the unclaimed property you can see here was a bill that was passed to require $1 million of the unclaimed property to go to this new grant matching account. And so this is similar to there's the first $7.6 million of unclaimed property goes to the Millennium Scholarship Trust Fund each fiscal year. Now there's this additional $1 million that goes to this grant matching account. And then any remaining amount of unclaimed property at the end of the fiscal year comes to the state general fund as an unrestricted general fund revenue source. And so, Madam Chair, that was the legislatively approved actions with regards to the unrestricted general fund revenue source. I just did want to point out that the next table has, we also have to account for tax credits. So you can see on the next page here that I have up, there were changes made to the Nevada Educational Choice Scholarship Tax Credit Program in AB 495. And by authorizing an additional $4.745 million in tax credits for that program. The authorization for the tax credits was actually available and made for FY 2022. But as fiscal staff looked through the amount of credits that are out there and then what's happening to that program in the pandemic here, we thought it's more likely that that additional amount of authorized credits by the time they would probably be awarded and taken. It's more accurate to record it as an additional potential revenue loss in FY 2023. So you can see again, that's the dynamics that as staff we're going through and trying to look at what the bill does and analyze what its impact would be and where that impact may occur in terms of placing it as an adjustment to the economic forms forecast in these tables. We have the
Mr. Gendon, I just want to pause really quick. Does anybody have any questions on what Mr. Gendon has covered so far? No? I would just say this is good information for like the future, because there's always a bill that either tries to amend or touch on a pre-existing subject. And so it's helpful to try to understand, what was that revenue impact? And so if anybody starts to make any changes, you can look at the prior revenue impact and then determine, okay, is this going to be good or positive or negative for the state? What's the change that they're trying to make? Is this change actually going to like exacerbate the revenue that we're expecting to come in because they want to either expand it, take it away? Because ultimately someone is either relying on that revenue to come in to pay for a particular program. And so I just wanted to quickly say that, and then we can continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Russell Gendon. So finally, on page 26 of table 2 yet, it's not unrestricted general fund revenues, but you can see we're listing the things that could change, either a revenue source that would have been for the distributed school account, the DSA in FY 2021, or now the new state education fund in FY 22 and FY 23. And so this just became part of the documentation that the Fiscal Analysis Division did. And so the one I think that I just did want to point out on here is this AB 363 from the 2021 session, which was Assemblywoman's Wynn bill with regards to again, it's sort of the peer-to-peer. It's I think it's generally sort of like the Airbnb, but people being rent their residences. So that could have a potential impact on the state 3% room tax. But again, that would not affect a general fund revenue source. It would affect the room tax going to the state education fund. And so again, you can see here, we weren't able to come up with an estimate that we felt comfortable looking up through all the dynamics of the bill that could occur. But obviously this will be something we will continue to monitor and evaluate in the interim as to this bill and what's going on. And so with that, Madam Chair, that was the information I wanted to present in these tables. What I just did want to point out for the committee members is sitting behind these tables we pulled out for the give to the committee here, the tax policy section from the 2021 Appropriations Report. So those that are familiar with the 2021 Appropriations Report, you may have seen this. But again, the tax team goes through all the bills that can make changes to the administration of a state and local tax, affecting the yield from a state and local tax, or economic development provisions, abatements, tax credits. We're going through all the bills. And so we attempt to write a very brief summary of each of those bills and put it into what we call the tax policy section of the Appropriations Report. And I just thought it might be worth providing that to the members of the committee. And so with that, Madam Chair, I think that was the information that I wanted to present on this with regards to your point that to allow the members of this committee, being revenue members, but just legislators in general, to have an understanding of what occurs after the end of a session with regards to revenue and general fund revenue, based on the actions that the legislature is approving, and having to then go and make adjustments to the forecast that the forum did in May. And with that, I'll answer any questions that the members of the committee may have.
So are there any questions? Assemblywoman Kasama.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Mr. Green. Great overview. Could you just go back to the page? What page number was it that had the final adjustment after all of these adding for legislation, for the new forecast? What was the final bottom line to the projected budgets?
So the pipelines are at the bottom of table 2 there for the general fund revenue portion. Sorry.
For the general fund, yeah. What was the fund? Which one? Kind of went through all these, so.
Oops, sorry. So it's actually right here. You can see on the small table, and sorry, I'm having a hard time. So I'm running.
There it is.
It's actually page 27 of the meeting packet. So it's we pull things together. So the net effect after the tax credit programs, you can see the net impact to the general fund. There were no adjustments for FY 2021. Except for the court decisions, $87.3 million. And then for the FY 2022, the net effect was $28.5 million to the positive. And then for FY 23, it was $22.9 million or $51.4 million for the biennium. For the unrestricted general fund revenue sources.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions? Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Neal. Thank you for an incredible presentation like usual. I do have 2 questions. The first is more of a philosophical question. Does the LCB also, or does the research, the financial division also track the federal legislation and its impact on some of our items? Or is that more something that is done in a different group? Because sometimes some of the federal legislation can sometimes have an effect on us as well.
That's a very good question, because you're absolutely right. So we try and monitor it, be aware of it. But one of the, I think, benefits is clearly we watch if they're going to do anything with regards to, from time to time, there's been what's called the Main Street Fairness Act, which would have been with regarding online sales and those types of legislation. I will say, thankfully, that Nevada does not have a personal or a state income tax. Because those states that do, they clearly have to pay attention to the federal income tax changes, because a lot of those states have their income taxes tied to the federal tax code. So here in Nevada, we don't have to worry about that type of federal law change to income tax codes, but we do have to watch what they're doing with regards to, would they have any bill that could change the sales tax. Also, we're watching bills with regards to marijuana legislation and things like that, and to just see if there's anything that could come in and have any effect. And the nice thing about that is we do have the NCSL organization that keeps track of a lot of that, as well as some of the other organizations. So we don't have to try and do that heavy lift ourselves. Vice Cohen, we can rely on other organizations to try and help us keep track of what the federal government and Congress may be doing that could have a downstream effect on the state of Nevada.
Thank you. That helps a lot, because Honestly, the reason why I was bringing it up was more about the housing things that are happening, but having that information about the the marijuana tax, as well as the sales tax, is a huge help. And then my other question is pretty general, and I know I could just look it up easily, but I can't at this time. So hopefully you've got it. When exactly does the language go into effect for the rental for Nguyen's bill that had to do with the Airbnbs and everything? I know that you had mentioned that for the hotel room tax, but I can't remember when exactly it takes into effect. Was it January, or was it July, or was it August?
We did not put it in the description for the table. I want to say it was January 1st, 2022. Is Michael or Joe, if they can refresh my memory better than I perhaps did?
And I can look it up as well. Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, for the record, Michael Nakamoto with Fiscal Analysis Division. Most of the provisions of that bill take effect on July 1st. So we still have
2022, correct?
Yes, correct.
Wonderful. So we will not be seeing that change at the local level in the Clark County School District in particular until next fiscal year, is basically what that means. Thank you so much.
Clark County is currently in the process of doing a survey and to get opinion on what their ordinance should look like. All right, so Mr. Gendon, I want to go ahead and skip number 7 and number 8 because it's already 3, and see if we could get into number 9. I think, because I feel like the presentation that you just gave, although they're different tables, crossed over into the court cases, which really is the MBT case. And then also, I think members can look at the actual collections versus the compared forum estimates in the table, or it's something we can discuss in a later meeting if it comes up and to reference. But I want to get into number 9.
Yeah, that works, Madam Chair. Excuse me, Russell, for the record. And again, yes, under 8, that's something we keep updated. So we can just possibly get into the position, Madam Chair, where as every month or a quarter, we get additional actual collections, so we can keep those tables updated and keep providing them to the members of the committee. And perhaps at a future meeting, we can just walk through them to help the members know how to read the tables and what they're looking at. But with that, then agenda item 9 will be Joe, my colleague Joe Reel, will make that presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Joe Reel, Deputy Fiscal Analyst at the Fiscal Analysis Division. I'll go ahead and share my screen to pull up that presentation. And is everyone seeing that okay?
Yeah, it's just kind of in super baby font. Is there any way to expand that just a smidge?
Let's see.
Will it go into full screen?
Is that any better? I think that gets about as big as it can get.
Okay. So it won't go to 75? I'm sorry, Mr. Reel. I don't have good glasses like that. I haven't reached bifocal level yet.
Joe, you need to click on full screen, right? That'll help load out.
Okay, give me 1 second here. I got a bunch of things weird going on here.
And then since they're slides, Madam Chair, once you get into the slides, they should look better once we get it in full screen.
Okay, thank you.
that any better? I think that gets us to full screen.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go forth, Mr. Rio.
Okay, so these are a set of charts that we present to the Economic Forum. And really, we're just looking at time series of employment, personal income and wages information. And so to start, we just take a look at U.S. total non-farm employment in the U.S. and then also in Nevada. So just to summarize quickly that U.S. employment, since the onset of the pandemic, you see the big decline in job growth. And then you see that we've rebounded to some extent in such that the percent change from beginning of the pandemic to currently, where it's now 2.9% below that previous peak, or 4.4 million jobs below the previous peak in terms of the US employment picture. In contrast, when we look at Nevada's employment, we're actually more down right now at 6.5% below the previous peak, or 93,000 jobs below the previous peak. However, when we look at what's the main cause of our decrease in employment, it's the leisure and hospitality industry. Almost 79,400 of those jobs that were still down is just this one industry of leisure and hospitality. So it's one sector that hasn't recovered, whereas many of the other sectors in Nevada's employment actually have recovered to pre-pandemic levels. But this one industry is the major decline still in the employment picture for the state of Nevada. This is looking at the year-over-year growth rates for the US as well as Nevada. And here we're measuring from when we took the dive in employment just after at the onset of the pandemic to the current 2021 third quarter numbers. And so you can see that the US average percent change, including the decrease and then the current rebound that we're experiencing, is a minus 2.7% average job growth. Nevada is actually a minus 5% job growth over that same period because we obviously suffered a bit more in terms of our impact on job growth than the national average. But I'll point out that in the last 2 quarters, Nevada is actually exceeding the national average again, similar to how we exceeded the national average prior to the pandemic. And then also typically we generally see Nevada's job growth being higher than the national average, with the exception of periods when we had the Great Recession and the amount of time it took to get back to being faster growing than the national average. And so while we're still below the national average in terms of from the onset of the pandemic to currently, we're sort of returning to trend in a sense that these last 2 quarters, Nevada's actual job growth is a little faster than the national average. The next chart just summarizes population growth rates because we're looking at things in terms of population and inflation. So I won't go into specifically all of that, but I think the inflation components is the thing to look at for part of this presentation. And these are just the index of the US CPI and some of the components. And I'm just really showing this one to show you the dramatic sort of change in the energy component over the last several quarters. And that's one of the major factors that is driving sort of the price increases and inflation increase that we're seeing currently. And you also have the food component that's also elevated at this point. This is showing the red line, the kind of headline CPI, all urban consumers, all items. And as been in the news, there's significant increase in the CPI, such that year over year, CPI is up this fourth quarter, 6.8%. When we take out the food and energy component, we still have 5% year over year growth for this fourth quarter. And these would have to go back to the 90s and in some cases the 80s to get inflation rates to this level. So when we look at things, we'll see that we're not doing as well in inflation adjusted terms because of these latest inflation rates. And again, this is now just the growth rates. When we add in the energy component and the scale really drops quite a bit, that this energy component is for this last quarter up 31%. And that's a major driver in why we're seeing the increases bleed over into transportation costs and other things that are contributing to the inflation in the food sector and other sectors. So this is looking at total personal income and the shares that the pieces of the personal income comprise. So we're looking at total wages and salaries in the red for the US, and typically they've been about 50% of total personal income. But we see the impact of the stimulus payments and other things with the onset of the pandemic, where when we had the job losses, we had a significant decrease in wages, and then things have kind of bounced around as we've come through the pandemic. But we're showing this in blue, the transfer payments, is a huge change in terms of the stimulus payments that individuals were receiving and the contribution to personal income. So the wages and salaries for the US, like I said, was about 50% of total personal income in 2021 first quarter. It has averaged 47.7% over this period since the pandemic. When we look at the transfer payments, typically they were 17% of total personal income, and then increased to over 22, almost 23% on average over the course of the pandemic. And of course, the spikes there over 25% when actual stimulus was being released in a sense. Similarly, in Nevada, it's even more dramatic in the sense that our wage and salaries decreased from 47.9% prior to the onset of the pandemic to over 40, to just 43.8% since then. But the transfer payments are even more of a dramatic increase from just under 17.
BPS. Mr. Real is frozen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. One moment while we
First quarter
troubleshoot
of
this for you.
2020, to average more than 25% since
There we
then.
go.
Mr. Real,
Salaries.
can you start back over on the Nevada? You froze.
I'm sorry, I did.
Yeah.
Noticing things are running kind of slow here.
Go to the Nevada slide, Joe, and start with that one.
The personal income.
It just came back. It's okay. So I'm back to Nevada total personal income. So I was highlighting just that the contrast to the US, that the wage and salary drop was a little more dramatic, and that we were at less than 48% of personal income in 2020 first quarter to average just 43.8%. But then the steep increase in the personal and the current transfer payments, where it was less than 17% of personal income in the first quarter of 2020 to over 25% or 24.9% since then. But with periods of that personal income making up more than 30%, transfer receipts making up more than 30% of total personal income when we were getting the stimulus resources. So now shifting to US total personal income and US total wages and salaries. When we typically try to look at these on a long-term basis, what we're doing is we generally would look at from peak to trough. But you notice with the stimulus influx that we started to measure just what happened in these statistics from before the pandemic to currently. So when we look at that piece of it, it says we're up 9.2%. But if we look at from the prior now peak that's been established after all the stimulus has subsided, that we're down 4.9% from that prior peak that was in 2021 first quarter. When we look at the wage side of it, we actually have a peak and a trough and then growth again, such that we're just measuring the percent change from this peak in 2020 first quarter to the current, and it's up 8.9% for wages. When we look at Nevada, similarly, that we're up 10.5% when we look at sort of pre-pandemic to current. But again, we're down 5% when we look at the latest peak. The wage side of things, the wage growth has 9.7% above the previous peak. And then we're looking at the growth rates for personal income. And here it's pretty comparable between the US and Nevada because it's 7.6% to 7.5% from the period prior to the pandemic to current. When we look at the actual wage and salary growth rates, we see that Nevada is still trailing slightly in terms of from the onset of the pandemic drop to current. US is 4.7% average growth, Nevada 3.7. But again, these last 2 quarters, you see that we're faster than the US average for these last 2 quarters. And that's kind of going back to the same trends that we saw prior to the pandemic impact and also prior to the Great Recession. But the impacts of these shocks to the system are very similar in terms of the impact on wage growth for both the US and Nevada. So now we're looking at per capita personal income, where we bring in a population component for the US. And so we're looking again at the growth from 2020 first quarter before the pandemic to current. We're up 9.8% for the US. But then back at that peak to current, it's down 5.1. And then this is looking at the same series, but in inflation adjusted terms. We can see that although it grew 9.8% in nominal terms, because of the inflation component, it's only up 3.9% over that same period. And again, the fall from the peak is 5.1% in nominal terms, but in inflation adjusted terms, it's much more dramatic that it's actually down 8.5% at the US level. When we look at Nevada, very similar in terms of the trend. It's up 8.7%. Pre-pandemic to current, but from the previous peak, it's down 5.7. And then in the inflation adjusted terms, it's only 2.9% growth compared to the nominal 8.7. And then the decline of 5.1 from the previous peak turns into a minus 9.1% from the peak in inflation adjusted terms for per capita personal income. And this is the same information, just more of a side-by-side comparison so that you can kind of see directly the differences between the US and Nevada in terms of the change from pre-pandemic to current, but then also looking at that prior peak to the current quarter. And so there's very comparable in terms of the total personal income piece. But then wages, I'm sorry, this is still per capita personal income in the inflation adjusted comparison with both US and Nevada side by side. And you have the similar decreases from the prior peak. And then kind of comparable in terms of the growth from pre-pandemic to current. This is the growth rates just for the per capita personal income, both US and Nevada side by side. And again, it's more comparable in terms of the comparison at 7.3% from the second quarter of 2020 to the most recent quarter versus 6.2% in Nevada. And again, just noticing that this very last quarter, the third quarter of 2021, third quarter, that the US growth rate is actually slightly below Nevada's growth rate. Similar again to how the trend was just prior to the onset of the pandemic. Similar, the inflation adjusted charts, same trend, just the lower growth rates associated with the inflation adjusted growth. And this is, now we're looking at wages and salaries on a per employee basis. And so this is kind of a counterintuitive view of things in that just prior to the pandemic, you see the level of US wages and salaries per employee. And then as the pandemic came aboard and we lost a lot of jobs, the actual wages per employee went up. That's generally an impact of losing wages at a less than the average in general terms, which drives up the average wage per employee. And then the growth that has occurred since then, such that we were up 12.2% over this period since the onset of the pandemic. However, when we look at things in the inflation adjusted terms, you see the spike there but because of the increases that we've seen in inflation, that it's kind of gone flat and actually declined in a sense from that previous period, that we're only up 6.2% on the US average from prior pandemic to current. Looking at Nevada, it's even a more dramatic change in the same trend, in that we're up 17.3% from the point just prior to the pandemic to current. But again, when you factor in the effects of the inflation, it's actually up only 11% and really gone flat or down even since the impact of losing all those jobs. And this is really another illustration of losing a lot of the jobs in the leisure and hospitality sector, which ultimately caused that wages to go up at the initial part of the pandemic. And then in these inflation adjusted terms really go flat. Again, this is just both the US and Nevada on a side-by-side comparison, just so you can see the difference in US 12.2% and Nevada 17.3% from the same point, sort of pre-pandemic to current. And then again, the inflation adjusted comparisons for both the US and Nevada, with 6.2% for the US and up 11% for Nevada. Again, these are showing just the growth rates for that same statistic, wages and salaries per employee. And again, you see the strong increase here, but that's again due to the loss of the jobs in the leisure and hospitality sector. And then showing that the average for the US is 7.8, and Nevada is actually stronger when you factor it all in from this point to current, and that is 8.9%. Similar trend when we look at it in inflation adjusted terms, just the slower growth rates. Then we have another measure in terms of just the comparison we were making between the US and Nevada in terms of median household income. This was a trend that we saw before the Great Recession, that Nevada had actually exceeded the national average in terms of median household income. And then when we had the recession, we were below that for quite a while. Until this 2019, we actually sort of regained our position in terms of being higher than the US average. But then with the onset of the pandemic, you can see that Nevada has fallen this 14%, whereas the US has fallen 1.7% in household income. We also show this in the inflation adjusted terms, in that the US from this peak is down 2.9, and Nevada is down a lot more dramatic, 15.1%. And then this is just the year-over-year growth rates for this most current period. And it just shows the more dramatic, that from the 1 year, US is down 1.7%, and then Nevada is down 14%. We also show that in inflation adjusted terms, where it's just a bigger decline. And then the last couple of charts, we're just showing the Nevada general fund revenue per $1,000 of personal income. And I think this will sort of lead into Mr. Ginden's presentation that he'll do following this. But we just kind of measure the general fund per $1,000 of personal income to look at over time how that has changed. And we see the impact of the decline in revenue in FY 2020, but then a slight rebound here in FY 2021. And then this just shows the both general fund growth rates and personal income growth rates, to just show those two side by side and sort of the trend that they both operate on and sort of move together. In that this last observation in FY 21, the personal income growth was just over 5%, whereas the general fund growth rate ended up at just under 10%. And that concludes that part of the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, members, any questions? I have a couple. So I want to go back to, well, because my question kind of relates to, it's similar for two slides. It's the US versus Nevada wage and salary growth rate, which was page 14 of 32. And there was, and looking at that, it's the 2021 quarter 3. And I guess what I was trying to figure out was what was triggering the change, because you kept repeating that we've had significant loss in leisure and hospitality, but I'm trying to figure out on this slide, what is triggering this particular change, and what do we have in regards to retirements? Because we did have, I don't know if it happened here, but I know nationally there were significant people that retired. And so there was an ability for one group to shift into other positions and then change their salary and salary growth because those positions were now vacant.
The big thing that really caused that is the loss of those leisure and hospitality jobs. What happens when you're looking at average wage per employee, and you lose a lot of the employees at wages that are below sort of the average of all wages, it causes that average per employee to actually go up quite a bit. And now as we see we're adding some of those jobs back, we see that the growth rate has kind of come back down quite a bit. So that's really sort of the thing that it's counterintuitive in that it looks like, hey, wage growth is really great, but it's more a factor of the loss of a large number of jobs in leisure and hospitality that on average were lower than the average wage for all jobs in the state. And so that caused the spike. But then now as we're adding those jobs back, then it's sort of equalizing, and we're going to see growth rates sort of fall back once we're through this, sort of impacted period to more traditional growth rates in the 3 to 4% rate that we've historically seen over time.
Because my other question was, I was also wondering, I had noticed that there was a trend when the workforce rates were down, and to incentivize workers to come back, they were increasing the wage. And whether or not within certain sectors, that was also helping to trigger and see kind of like that spike in salary growth rate in Nevada, because now instead of offering $9 an hour, we saw certain folks offering $11 an hour. So like maybe at, Domino's, it was 9, now it's 11. And so there was a certain sector of jobs where there was an increase in personal income, number one, for the lower tier, I would say, group of Nevadans. They saw maybe a $1 to $2 increase in their salary and wage or personal income.
I'm sure those things are actually happening, and I'd imagine would get lost in sort of the impact of this shock to the system. And so, yes, we are sort of getting that with the labor supply issues, and that, the great sort of resignation that's occurring. So that is mixed into all of this, and that, we are starting to see actual wage pressure at the individual job seeker level. But that's combined with this shock to the system in terms of losing a bunch of those jobs. And then now we're slowly bringing some of those jobs back. And then also the factors that you just talked about, that you're actually seeing some wage gains independent of the job, employment growth or decline.
Well, thanks for that presentation. Are there any questions to Mr. Reel? Okay. So I really wanted to have this conversation just to kind of give you guys context, because I wanted to understand kind of what's happening nationally, what's happening in Nevada, because we have these conversations around income growth, wage growth, where are Nevadans? And it's really good to help us try to understand like what is happening in our state when we talk about revenue and when we talk about revenue policy. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, all the time, it's really good to have a broader scope of how that revenue policy can gain an impact. Because still at the end of the day, when you have, these kinds of changes happening within income and salary, we have to determine still, what's the appropriate pacing in order to still stabilize, our revenue, which stabilizes our services. Because if we still have a loss of individuals within the workforce, that means that they're still relying on services, and those services still have to be there, and we still have to pay for those services. And so there's always that inner question of, do we have enough revenue to continue to sustain whatever that percentage of persons that are, now relying on services that we have to continue longer because the pandemic is still going on. And so I just like to think about those things in those terms, because I'm always thinking globally about, is there enough revenue? And I know people are like, oh, but, we had, a significant amount that was put into the forum, but I'm always asking the question, absent of federal influx of money, if come 2024, 2025, should we be examining what our tax statutes look like to make sure that we have policy in place if there is a shift? Because in 2025, we may see an entirely different landscape. And I'm a pre-planner, right? I like to plan for what could be rather than try to haphazardly move policy in 2025 when people are scrambling and trying to figure out how to take care of the needs of the state. And so that was my reason for wanting to have this conversation, because I feel like we settle and say, oh, we're good, and we don't really need to do anything. But I'm always thinking about, how can we plan and be better? I don't know how many people on the committee try to plan for the future, but I'm seriously about planning for the future and making sure that we have our tax statutes actually have enough revenue for what could be the future impact on the state. So I'm just putting that out there, because that's going to be a consistent trend as I build into my modernization persuasion tactics. So, Mr. Kindon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Russell Kindon. And so I have the next agenda item, item 10. And so this item comes out of sort of the discussion and statements that the chair just made of asking staff about looking at the state's revenue sources in terms of this inflationary environment that we're in now, but inflation in general, but also what does it mean to look at our revenue structure and the different taxes. And so clearly, I think all of you are intuitively aware that, yeah, the inflation component of a tax can depend on the statutory structure for the tax, such as the sales tax. As the price of things go up, then the sales tax should also go up. And then obviously, as people come to the state or the people regain their jobs and start consuming more, that's the demographic component of a tax. So we have taxes in the state general fund that have both a demographic and an inflationary component to them, such as the sales tax. But we also have some taxes that don't have an inflationary component to them. They just have the demographic, such as the liquor tax and the cigarette tax, because they're based on the unit, not the price. So with that, I wanted to go through a set of tables that actually were created probably about 10 years ago originally out of a legislative request, and to go through those. But to do that, I wanted to just spend a couple minutes going through a table. And this is not intended, to insult anyone. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. Is that to make sure that we all have the same working construct for this concept of how you're going to look at a revenue source. And this, as you saw in Mr. Reel's slides, this per capita basis, this inflation adjusted per capita basis, and what that means when you think about revenues or a government program. So I just thought through this and put together this set of tables. And so what I have here is in scenario one, let's just assume you have year one. So you want to have a program or revenue source and set up, and let's say that it generates $100 in year one, and you have one person that you're going to provide services to using that revenue as a caseload. But then, so then when you go over here, you can see obviously on a per capita basis, it's the same. It's 100. It's 100 divided by 1. And in an inflation adjusted, it's the 100 because this is our base reference year. Because whenever you're doing inflation adjusted things, you have to have a reference or a base year. And then I just wanted to get the construct of that you can go index. And so it'll be less relevant here for scenario 1, but as I move into, I'll explain the indexing. So let's assume here in scenario 1 that in year 2, the revenue source generates the same as the year 1, $100. So there was no increase in the revenue, there was no increase in the caseloads, and there was no inflation. So you can see in per capita terms, in inflation and per capita terms, you're standing in the same place, right? That's the way it works because you're just adjusting your actual dollar amount here, dividing by caseloads to get the per capita, and then you're dividing by inflation rate to get the inflation adjustment. So if we go to scenario 2, where your revenue goes up by $5 in year 2. So you went from 100 to 105, well, that's a 5% increase. And so, but you didn't have an increase in caseloads. But you had 5% inflation in year 2 compared to year 1. So in per capita terms, you're at $105 and it went up 5%. But after you adjust for inflation, you can see that you're still in inflation adjusted per person terms. You're at $100 per person. That's what the inflation is doing when you adjust for that is you go, yeah, it looks like we're 5% better off, and you are. But if you want to measure it in relation to what you were collecting or spending in a base reference year, you can see that in inflation adjusted per capita terms, you're no better off. So then the indexing is simply taking and dividing these numbers by the reference year, year 1. So you get, in the funding revenue, you get an index of 105 compared to the base year of 1, or the 5% increase. You get the 105 compared to the 5% increase per capita, but 0. So indexing is a way to take things that don't have the same scale and put them on a comparable scale by indexing to a reference year. So then in scenario 3 here, we now go, well, your revenue and your funding for this program increased by $100. So it went up 100% to $200. But there's also a caseload increase of 1. Well, that's 100% increase in the caseload going from the 1 to 2. And again, here we have no inflation. So you can see then that in per capita terms, you're at $100 in each year. In inflation adjusted, you're at $100. Why? Because the revenue or funding amount you need went up the same as your caseloads. So you're standing in the same place in both per capita terms and inflation adjusted terms over the 2 years, year 1 and year 2. And then you can just see the indexing is showing the same effect in terms of the percent changes when you look at the metrics that are being computed. So in scenario 4, we have, it's like scenario 3, where you have a $100 increase in your revenue or funding amount, and you have the caseload increasing by 1, going from 1 to 2, but you now have 5% inflation. So you can now see on per capita terms, it's like scenario 3, that you're, before you account for inflation, you're spending $100 per person, or you have the revenue of $100 per person. But when you go over to the inflation adjusted now, you can see the inflation adjusted amount actually went down to $95.24, which was approximately a 4.8% decrease. So in inflation adjusted terms, even though your revenue went up by 100% and your caseload went up by the same, but because of inflation going up by 5%, in inflation adjusted per capita terms, you're now have less revenue or funding per person than you had in your base reference year 1. And you can see again, the indexing it to the base year 1, you get the metrics to show the same result. But you'll see when I get to the charts here in a little bit where these constructs come into play. Finally, scenario 5 is showing, okay, your revenue didn't go up from $100 by $100 to $200. It went up by $110 from $100 to $210 here, or 110%. So your caseload, again, goes from 1 to 2. It goes up by 1, or that's 100%. And you've still got the same 5% inflation as in scenario 4. Well, what happens when you look at it in per capita terms? Hey, it went up by $105 to $105 per person, or by the 5%. But in inflation adjusted per capita terms, you're standing in the same place as your year 1 reference year. And then again, the indexing metrics show the same results. Why is this? So when you think about you have a program or a revenue source that has funding tied to it, and you want to think about how does this compare to a past reference year, you can now see as how the metrics can work out when you look at a per capita and inflation adjusted per capita terms to allow you to compare back to that prior period. And thus, in a sense, you saw that in Mr. Real's charts when he was showing the personal income, the wage and salaries on the current dollars and the inflation adjusted dollars. And then when you put it per capita terms to let you see what happens once you account for the effect that inflation has in increasing the nominal actual dollars that you're collecting. And then once you account for inflation, what the purchasing power is, what we call that, can be of that dollar. And then when you think, well, you're possibly using those dollars to fund caseloads for a program. So with that, Madam Chair, I just wanted to get out there to sort of show these simple examples that this is this construct here of what's going on, because you'll see that in this table of charts that I'm going to bring up now for the total actual general fund. And it's my hope that as this committee continues to look at other revenue sources during this interim, we can keep this same kind of context in place as we look at them to do this comparison of what the revenue sources look like in a historical construct. So with that, sorry. Hang on, you just got to get through Joe's slides here. And so I'll be going to, here we go. So I'll blow this up as much as I can, but it's actually page 125 of the meeting packet for those that want to try and look at it on their own computer screens. So what this table does is it takes going all the way back to FY 1990 through FY 21, these will be the actual amounts, and then FY 22 and FY 23 are the economic forms forecasts for each year adjusted for the legislative actions in the court. So what this is showing the actual total unrestricted general fund revenue for each of these fiscal years, and then the forecast for the last few years. It's showing you the statewide population. These are the state demographers, governor's certified estimates, except for the last 3 years, which are based on the demographers' projections. Here's the consumer price index. And I've indexed it so that FY 1990 equals 1 to reset the base reference year to FY 1990, as you'll see it when I go forward here. And then I've showing you the combined population and inflation growth rate, and then calculating the inflation adjusted per capita or dollars per person in terms of general fund revenue, inflation adjusted per person. So then here I blocked it out with the lines to just try and show you those, since we're a biennium state, they're the bienniums. And so it's just like, again, this came out of a legislative request, possibly around 8 to 10 years ago, and thought, given Senator Neal's as chair, a discussion about looking at inflation, looking at what it means to be, as a revenue committee, evaluating the state's revenues and revenue structure. So if we come down here to the bottom, you can see the average over the entire period, including the 2 forecast years. And we did not get a chance to go through that and possibly at a future meeting. Michael Nakamoto can make his presentation, but in terms of how the actual collections for FY21 compared to the forecast, and then the show how the current year-to-date collections. But this forecast here of minus 1.1%, that's comparing the forecast for 22 to the actual for 21. The economic forum actually projected growth, but because the FY21 actuals came in above the forecast, we can now actually decline by 1.1% here in FY 2022 and still hit this forecast of 4.426 billion. But I just want to point out, so this is a little bit of an anomaly that's coming out of the data, but these are the forecasts, thus these are the growth. But if you look over the entire historical period from FY 1990 to FY 2023, the average growth in the general fund revenues were 6.1%. But population grew 3.1% on average. Inflation was 2.6%. So inflation and population grew 5.7%. So then when you go look in what happens in an inflation adjusted per person terms, it only grew 0.4%. So that's the translation of looking that your revenues on average grew 6.1%. But after accounting for sort of your population and inflation growth on a per person terms, they grew 0.4%. And then what I've just done here is broken out each of the decades. And so I'm not going to go through each of them, but you can see that the growth here in your general fund revenues on average over the different decades, realizing that we've only got 2 actual years and 2 forecast years in this biennium so far, but you have for the 1990 to 99 decade, you had 8.7 growth average in general fund revenues, but only 0.1% after accounting for inflation. Then you go to FY 2010 to 2019, you had an average growth of 4.7%. Remembering we had the Great Recession affecting that decade. And so you had, but you come over here and go, well, we had 1.6% growth, which was much higher than these prior reference periods. Well, you go look, your population growth slowed down from averaging in these over these periods to 1.4%, but you also had inflation averaging. So you can see again the dynamic of what goes on, that you had less average growth in your revenues in this 2010 to 2019 decade compared to these. But because you had lower inflation population inflation in that decade also, the average for the growth in inflation adjusted per person terms was actually higher than the prior periods. So with that, then that's the tabular presentation of the data. So, sorry. So this is page 126, and this is just going to chart the data that's in the table. And I think lots of times both tabular and graphic presentations of the information are helpful, because I think we're all wired differently in terms of how we process information. So, but what this chart does is it takes the growth rates from the table. And so the thick blue line here, that's the growth in general fund revenue, fiscal year to fiscal year over that complete historical period. The thin line, and this is actually looks light blue, it's light purple in the real world. So that is the inflation rate from fiscal year to fiscal year. The thin red line is the growth in population. The green line is the growth in inflation and population, right? So what this is going to tell you is when the growth rate for the thick blue line, that is the growth in general fund revenue, exceeds the green line, then your inflation adjusted per capita revenue is going to go up in that fiscal year compared to the prior fiscal year. When the green line is above the thick light blue line, then the opposite occurs, right? Because that's what's happening is when, if your inflation and population growth outpaces your revenue growth, then the inflation adjusted per capita has to go down. So when you're looking at things in terms of just separating out, say, the red line, population, and this thin blue/purple line, of inflation. Well, you can see here there are times where, hey, both of the thin lines can be below your growth rate in general fund revenue, but population inflation combined were above your revenue growth. So then you see in those fiscal years where either population or inflation growth was greater than your revenue growth, then you're clearly going to have trouble maintaining your inflation adjusted revenue, inflation adjusted per capita revenue. So that's just, in a sense, graphically showing the growth rates that are in the chart. So then you go, well, let's plot the general fund revenues actual. So this is, you can see this is the current dollars or the actual dollars. And then here's inflation adjusted. So it allows you to see, like Mr. Real's charts, that you can see the growth that will occur in your dollars. But then once you account for inflation, from time to time, you see it doesn't grow as much, or at many times it may actually flatten out compared to the growth that you see. And again, due to the inflation, once you adjust for inflation. So right, inflation can be a factor along with your demographics that are causing your revenues to grow. But when you have to account for the inflation relative to this FY 1990 reference period, then you see the results that occur. And I'll just point out that there's nothing magical about picking up 1990 as the reference period, but you have to pick a reference period when you're going to do this kind of analysis and presentation. And I just tried to pick, I was asked by the legislator to go back as far as I thought reasonable. So I went back all the way back to FY 1990 when I was doing this about 10 years ago. And FY 1990, I wasn't in the state yet, but this would have been a year just before the slight recession that occurred in FY 1991. Just as a reference point, that you try and pick a reference here that there's maybe not too much special or unique going on in it. But then, so you can see what was going on, and then I'll just point out here now in this chart, so to use that as reference. Well, so in 2003, that we had a fairly significant change to taxes that was estimated to generate somewhere around 800 and some million. And then what happened is we caught the economy, right, being in that very hot state that we did the tax increase in the 2003 session because the tax changes became effective in FY 2004 and 5. And then you can see what happened. And then we have the Great Recession here. And then in the 2009 session, there were revenue enhancement actions taken. Possibly one of the more notable ones was the IP1 for the 3% room tax was put in place. That went into the general fund for a few years and now is in the state education fund. It was in the DSA for a few years. And then you went along here, and then in the 2015 session, you had tax changes, such as I discussed, the commerce tax was put in place, the modified business tax rates were increased. And so then you can see here's what's happening until we get to the pandemic recession. So that's what's happening. So then the next chart goes and says, well, let's now, the first chart that I just showed, the previous chart I showed you was just accounting for inflation. So now let's account for the demographic component, i.e. population, and put it on per capita terms. So again, here you can see what happened in the current dollars, so the actual dollars divided by population to get to per capita. Here they are in inflation adjusted per capita. So again, the reference period FY 1990, it was $650 approximately per person in inflation adjusted terms and the current dollars. So then you can see as the current dollars are increasing, but then you can see that basically from this period through here, in inflation adjusted per capita terms, general fund revenues on it were generally going down over that period. Then you had the tax changes that got us up above the 650 that for the FY 1990 reference period, because again, we had the tax changes and caught a possibly overheated hot economy. And then here's the Great Recession, fell back below the 650 amount. The 2009 tax changes got us back above that reference point, and then we started falling again. And then you had the 2015 session tax changes that got us above this FY 1990 650 per person reference period in inflation adjusted per capita terms. And then you can see the FY21 actually came up from FY 2020. And then again, you have the forecast period, but again, I will point out those are the numbers, but they're possibly a little anomalous just because of where the forecasts are in relation to what we probably know what's going on in the economy. So that's allowing you to see the data in a graphic form. So then you go, well, can we put that together in one chart so I can see it all at once? And the answer is yes, but then what I realized when I looked through these charts again last night, that part of my label is missing. So this should say millions of dollars. So this line, the current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars, those are millions of dollars, like the chart was. What this should also say, and dollars per person for the per capita chart, right? Because I'm taking this chart and putting it together with the other chart. So I apologize for that, but the millions, it should say millions of dollars and dollars per person, because these are the charts that are on the per capita that are dollars per person. So you can see one of the problems that you have when you try and bring just an inflation adjusted measures into one chart and per capita, that I've got a scale problem. Why? One's in millions of dollars, one's in dollars per person. So you can put them in the same charts, but your reference point gets hard at times. So then what we do is we index, and that's what I was doing in the other chart. So what you do in indexing, you go take the number for each one of these fiscal years for every one of these lines, and you divide it by the FY 1990 amount. So you're forcing FY 1990 to be your base reference year and set it equal to 1. So now you can put all the metrics together into one chart and look at what they look like. So here is the increase in actual general fund dollars, as you can see it occurring. And again, the sessions where taxes were changed and how they're going up. Well, here it is after you adjust for inflation. Here it is comparing it on per capita terms, but not adjusting for inflation. And finally, here's doing inflation adjusted dollars per capita. And then so 1, I just put a thicker line in there because that's your reference point. 1 is your FY 1990 base reference. So when you look at these, you can take these numbers here and use them to compare across. And thus you can see that this is a relatively flat line when you look at it in inflation adjusted per capita terms in terms of the state's total unrestricted general fund revenue dollars over this relatively long historical period. Again, comparing that to the FY 1990 inflation adjusted per capita general fund dollars. So finally, then, what I thought it might be worth pulling out, this bottom line, so you can see it as to where it was going down here. So at one point in time here, FY 2003, the general fund revenues per capita were approximately 14% below that FY 1990 reference period in terms of the dollars being generated per person on an inflation adjusted per capita basis. And so then here again, here's the tax increase that are going up, coming down, Great Recession, going up due to the revenue enhancement actions that were approved in the 2009 session. Then it gets down to almost 10% below. And then because of the 2015 session, it gets approximately operating somewhere around 4% above that FY 1990 reference period, went down due to the pandemic, and then it's gone back up to approximately 4% above that FY 1990 reference. Then the final way that you can then go look at this in terms of wanting to go look at, well, how did our general fund revenues actually perform and how would they have performed had we taken the FY 1990 reference period and they would have grown by population inflation? So again, this is the green line that you've seen in all these charts, that this is the actual dollars that were collected from FY 1990 through FY 2021. I left the 2 forecast years out to just stay with actual dollars. So then this dark line is taking the FY 1990 amount and growing each year by the growth rate in population inflation. So it's another way of visualizing that. Well, if you would have started an FY 1990 amount and general fund revenues would have increased by population inflation, this is what it would have generated. Here's what was actually generated. So it's another way of visualizing that how you were running below population and inflation growth, then you went above due to the tax changes and the sort of heated economy. And then we had the Great Recession, then the legislature dealing with the impacts of the Great Recession on general fund revenues and doing revenue enhancements in the 2009 session, got back up, but then fell back off. And then the 2015 tax changes got us now that we were running above it a little bit. And then here you're coming down. And so part of this is Madam Chair, members of the committee, I think these are an interesting set of charts. I realize it's possibly a lot of information presenting it quickly, but it would be my goal as we talk about the sales taxes and other taxes, we can create these charts so you can see what they look like. Because I think you're going to find some interesting things as members of a revenue committee when say to go look at the sales tax, which does have both an inflationary and a demographic population component to it, and see how it compares, especially for the state general fund. The 2% rate has been the 2% rate, right? That's the rate that the legislature cannot change without a vote of the people. So you go look at that. And so what's changing in it is the demographics and inflation, but also, as you know, we've had changes here in the last few years where we've picked up online sales into the sales tax base through the Wayfair versus South Dakota court case implementation of that court decision to regulations. And then we had AB 445 from the 2019 session was the marketplace facilitator bill. And we can try and get information to see what would have that done as to, you can see general fund revenue growth, sort of this uptick here prior to the Great Recession, and to see if we can look at, well, what revenue sources in the general fund were triggering it. And so with that, Madam Chair, that was the information that I wanted to present on this agenda item. Given your discussion with me as to try and create a way to have the members of the committee start thinking about revenue sources, the general fund revenue, this inflation and demographic component, to what it means when you look at the total general fund, but what it will mean as we potentially look at other revenue sources this interim. And with that, I'll answer any questions, Madam Chair.
So any questions from members? Vice Chair Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. And again, thanks for the presentation. So with all this, knowing that the Fed is going to raise interest rates in March, how does that play into the forecasting, and in general, how do interest rates impact all of this?
Well, the Fed has to start raising interest rates. Sorry for the record, Russell again in the fiscal division. That the trying, in a sense, it should slow the economy, right? Because higher interest rates means people may not buy houses or other capital purchases that require interest. Businesses may not do capital investment and stuff like and things like that. So then, higher interest rates should slow the economy. How much we'll have to see. And then as you slow the economy, should that start to possibly bring inflation back under control? The interesting thing for me as an economist, I've never been through a pandemic and don't care to, I want to get out of this one and not go through another one in my lifetime. So it's hard for me to think about some of these economic concepts, such as raising interest rates and what the Federal Reserve is doing with regards to managing monetary policy in relation to inflation and their interest rates targets and all that. So it's something we will be monitoring and have to watch as they do things. To answer your question from the forecast side of things versus just monitoring what's going on with actual collections in relation to the current forecast, it's a good thing that we'll have a few months to see what they're going to do and see if we can get any data to figure out what it might mean for the economy. Because under the economic form statutory forecast process, the forecasters who will prepare forecasts and present them to the Economic Forum, they don't have those first meetings till October, November, where we would begin to present preliminary forecasts before presenting the final forecast. That then will, from those forecasts, will adopt a forecast on or before December 3rd, 2022 for FY23 and FY24 and FY25 of the next biennium. So I know that may not have been the response you were wanting or expecting, but from a forecast perspective, we will hopefully we'll have some information, and some of the supply chain stuff can get worked out. So maybe at least those issues are getting behind us, and we can start to think about what it means for an economy going forward without some of these distortions that are occurring, to be able to forecast FY23, FY24, and FY25 approximately 10 to 11 months from now.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions? So Assemblyman Anderson, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Neal. I do have questions, but I'm still trying to formulate it. So that's why I was like, there's a lot of information here to try to grasp. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to ask.
I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot, and I
might be emailing individually because I just can't quite formulate what I'm trying to ask exactly. It's just a lot of information.
Okay.
Thank you though for the presentation. It's a lot to think about. Yeah.
So any additional questions? Because I know Mr. Ginn and I had one quick one. I think it's quick, but I really wanted to know how does erosion affect our tax base when we know that these factors are going on? I mean, I think I know the answer, but I want you to answer it.
Well, by erosion, I will work under the context of that. And so I'll just go through it and you can let me know if I got close to answering your question. So as I've talked, let's take the sales tax. So as I've stated, the sales tax has a demographic and an inflationary component to it. That is, as people come to the state or visitors come to the state, the taxes should grow from the sales tax. And then as inflation goes up, then, hey, before you adjust for inflation, your tax collection should go up in the sales tax. But then what you can have is things that affect the tax base, irrespective of the number of people who are consuming and buying things, be they residents or visitors. So if you have things that end up that are exempt, so as you do add exemptions to the sales tax, in some sense, you guess perhaps in your vernacular, Madam Chair, is that could be construed as it's an erosion of the tax base. Thus, everything else the same, the tax collections will come down because you've taken something out of the tax base that previously somebody could consume and the tax would apply to. But realizing that, right, that those can be a very important policy debates that elected officials have to do. You also have abatements that can, it doesn't affect the tax base, but it can take revenue off because it's the thing is still taxable. It's just not taxable for specific people who are granted the abatement. Finally, I think you can have the things that have been discussed by Mr. Brainerd with NCSL and you brought up, and possibly your staff has hinted at, that right, for our sales tax, Nevada is a state that has a sales tax that's tangible personal property. Been that way since 1955 when it was put in place. Other states, their sales tax attaches to services. And perhaps I can show some stuff to the committee. The show since the end of World War II, that the change that's occurred, people consuming more services versus goods, and goods being tangible personal property. So part of that can be an erosion that can occur. People are changing their consumption behavior. And then continuing on that, Madam Chair, can be, well, not only are they're changing whether they're buying goods and services, they're changing how they're consuming them, such as that was brought up today, that we don't buy CDs anymore. We don't buy printed books very much. We're buying things in the electronic or digital form. So, right, as those things and VCSH tapes, as we went from that to CDs, well, at least VCH tapes and CDs were still tangible personal property. So there was some sales tax. But as you transition from tangible personal property to intangible or non-tangible personal property, then your tax base is eroding, I guess, to use your term. And now you can see the final part that he did. Well, it's not only, well, we used to buy movies and CDs, movies on CDs, VHS tapes, as we transition to that, we don't do that. We stream stuff. So it's not only in part of all where the additional erosion that was occurring, but at least Nevada and many other states have been probably successful or partially successful in stopping some of that erosion was the transition to people buying things online, which then weren't subject to the sales tax. They probably were subject to the use tax. But now through the Wayfair versus South Dakota and the marketplace facilitator bill, we've been able to sort of make improvements on changing the erosion that was occurring from that change in people's consumption behavior, just because of what's occurring in society or the economy with regards to how products or services are allowed to be consumed by businesses and people. So hopefully that at least touched a little bit on maybe what you were wanting to get at.
It did. I mean, it did. Because I know it's a lot for our first meeting and a lot to throw everybody into, but I was trying to get some analysis around what is the effect on our tax base in what's currently happening, and then also kind of have the ability to drill down when Mr. Gendon talked about when you have abatements, which to me is looked at as a removal of items from the tax base. And then also what happens when you fail to capture things in the tax base because there is a shift, which is what Gendon is describing as consumption, like how we are then consuming items that we're taxing or not taxing at this moment. Because of the digital activity, we're not engaged in capturing that activity. And that has been a shift in consumption. Everybody knows that I had that bill, but I'm trying to understand, what do we need to do? Is it still appropriate, right, to move the bill, understanding what's going on and doing a deeper analysis? And what is the effect of moving that bill? Will it be the saving grace later, which is what I believe, or not? And in order for me to do that analysis, it is to think about all of these factors and to see what does it mean when we fail to capture activity in our tax base, but it is an actual behavior that is affecting us. And that's where I'm at, right? And I'm just kind of saying all this to kind of help you guys understand, like as chair, what am I thinking about? Why do we do this kind of analysis on inflation and growth and wages? Because the argument that was made in 21 was that we were not in a position as a state, that citizens were not in a position in the state to handle a digital goods tax. The question now that I am considering and thinking about is, can we afford not to have a digital goods tax when we know that there is a shift in consumption behavior and our sales tax statute is not meeting that consumption, nor is it accessing that consumption where we're capturing that revenue? And at the end of the day, the citizens are still going to rely on services. There's still going to be caseload that we need to meet. And is our revenue in a position where it will withstand a wait for 2 years to 2025? Or should this be an activity that we engage in 2023, knowing that in 2025, everything will come to roost and we will have to deal with it anyway. And to do policy in a non-stressful session where we can debate it, think about it, and then move it forward. And so these are the things I'm thinking about because I don't want to do policy in a vacuum. I want to do a policy understanding all of the implications of the decision upon Nevadans, and also being able to really think through as a group the benefits and the setbacks. And so I hope that, you know, it wasn't too much and you guys get a chance to like really process through all of it, because we're going to build upon this framework and go deeper. I don't know if that makes anybody feel better to go deeper, but I want to do a deep dive into revenue and actually do analysis to help us understand what is the policy that we should be doing and why we're going to do it. Put aside political reasons and just think about what's good for Nevada, what's good for our future, what's good for planning for our future, and really doing analysis on how Nevadans are shifting their consumption behavior and what we need to do to pick that up. So I'll put a period there, and then we can go to, which is agenda item number 11, which is, what are the topics do you think we should discuss for the interim? If you guys have any thoughts now about, all right, Assemblywoman Kasama.
I actually just want to thank you for your, for your imploring us to look at this at a 30,000 foot level, because I think that is, we have wonderful staff that can prepare the details for us, but I really applaud your effort at having us focus at the 30,000 foot level and what does it mean, and it's an important responsibility for us, and I just appreciate your thoughts and comments on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Members, any thoughts on what you would like to study during the interim? Assemblywoman Considine.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all of this context and foundation to get started. I definitely am interested in learning more, and that might change one of the things that I'm interested in looking at, but I am interested in looking at property taxes, equitable property taxes. I may be wrong, but it was my understanding that certain businesses can apply for waivers to not have to pay property taxes. I need to find out if that's true, and if that's the case, something that I would like to sort of look into a little bit more for the equitable area of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good one, because if you remember in this presentation, it's one of the ones that my understanding is inflationary resistant. So it's definitely appropriate to have the conversation. It's a political dynamite, but I think it also it's a modernization conversation. We need to modernize our property tax statutes in general. Any other ideas? Assemblyman Haven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd just like to say, I think this has been an excellent presentation by staff. I always enjoy the numbers and looking at all of this. And I know this kind of came up during the NCSL presentation, but when you start looking at the different syntaxes, I think that you also start seeing that, when your effective tax is like 25% on some of it, you see an increase in the black market. And so hopefully I'd like to look at ways to address some of that, whether it's, as I stated earlier, lowering the tax to prevent the black market or targeting the black market a little more. But as you stated, Madam Chair, we're missing out on some of this in different areas. And I definitely think that that's something that we should be looking at is areas that, whether it's people smuggling cigarettes into the state or otherwise, definitely hitting us in that realm. And so I do look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. Anyone else? Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to echo also what Assemblymember Hafen brought up. What an excellent presentation, and looking forward to the discussion. I think this was an item that was discussed a little bit during the last session. I think Assemblymember Kasama had touched upon it a little bit with some of the things, and it kind of goes in hand with what your philosophy is as well. It sounds like that has to do with like the loopholes that exist with possibly the hotel room tax and or other taxes that exist, that revenue that exists, excuse me, and how exactly those schedules take place. For example, if for the hotel room tax, if somebody pays through a third-party provider and not to the hotel, is that money going to what it's supposed to go to? Those sort of like little loopholes. And I don't think I'm wording it correctly, but that idea of possibly who's providing the services, if the revenue is being tracked accurately, or if there are third-party organizations that are coming in and making a big change to how exactly that money is being counted. I think would be something that would be, if there's a possibility of having those discussions.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyone else? Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair. Assemblywoman Anderson. I believe Assembly Bill 363 for the short-term rentals. I believe it has responsibility for the third party, like the Airbnb, the third party hosts. And I believe there was even some penalties in that, and that the problem with enforcement, I think it will be random audits is how it's set up to double check that they're sending in the revenue. So that's something that I believe there's a framework for it in that bill, but then it's probably something that we have to make sure is being handled the way it was intended so that we can generate those revenues. That was a big point of that bill as well.
Thank you for that. Any additional ideas on what to study during the interim? Okay. Well, this has been a good meeting. I won't implore you guys like I'm in school saying, please write letters to your congressman about the careful balance between inflation and our economy. But I'm definitely on the bandwagon of trying to make sure that we control the inflation that's going on in our environment so that we're not negatively affected in the state of Nevada. It's a real conversation. And I know people are playing it as like, you know, this is all against Democrats, and but it's a real conversation that we knew was coming, and it had to be worked around a delicate balance. And I think it's time that we have that conversation, or at least start raising that up the same way we'd raise up an issue of Medicaid, because it's real and it's going to affect us. And that's the end of my political statements for this evening. And we will then we'll be scheduling future meetings. We're going to go ahead and get that schedule out after this meeting. So you guys can put that on your calendar. We're probably going to be aiming for this 1 o'clock time period after I get off work. But it may not be on a Wednesday. But Anna will get that out to you guys. And so we will go ahead and open up for public comment, which is agenda item number 13. BPS.
Thank you, Chair Neal. There are no participants on the line to provide public comment at this time.
Okay, then. So then we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Thank you guys, everybody, for being here for our first meeting. And think about your questions and ask Russell, Joe, and Mr. Nakamoto will be able to present next time And I apologize that he couldn't present today, but have a good Wednesday.